Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just to remind you that this meeting is being broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings. So welcome to those of you who are watching online. So if you can make sure your phones are on mute, and remember that no photography or recording is allowed in the meeting. Okay, members, so I'm going to proceed through the agenda. We don't have any apologies. Any declarations of interest? No? Okay. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about was the murder in my constituency at the end of September, and the news has only come out in the last few days of Mary Ward. A tragic incident, and I think there's quite a lot more about the story that's going to come out, and I suppose it shows why we need to be so focused on the ending violence against women and girls strategy and its delivery. Another small point, and then I'll get on to another matter, and that's just that officials are working with on the practical arrangements for the Interparliamentary Forum meeting on Friday the 15th of November of this year. The forum will be discussing issues around intergovernmental relations, and to this end this assembly is hosting the forum this time around, and the invitation to the newly appointed Minister for Intergovernmental Relations will come to speak to the forum. I'm just seeking your support to actually issue that invite. Okay, so members, just in terms of follow up from last week, and I have committed to asking. Sorry. Oh, we're not ready?
Yeah, we're open. Yes, we're open sessions. They just come.
Oh, they're coming in. That's okay. If you take a seat, we're not ready for you just yet. You're not ready for you just yet. Sorry. No, it's fine. It's fine. So, members, it's in relation to the your thoughts. I would like your thoughts on whether we would be inviting the First Minister and or the junior ministers and or all four of the ministers back off the back of the committee session last week. So obviously we've got three panels today, so in terms of your response, I would appreciate if you can be articulate in terms of the reasons why we would invite them back, if there's any examples, any particular matters that were raised at committee or otherwise that you feel would strengthen the case for asking the First Minister, etc. back. So I'll hold back until the end. We may have to put this to the vote, but I'm going to go to the Deputy Chair first to see if she has any thoughts on whether we should invite them back.
Yeah, I'm always up for the Deputy First Minister coming before committee. I am conscious that we would have ideally liked to have seen them and the junior ministers more, and I think there's no harm in it. I'm inviting them back to have regular chance to ask them questions in relation to the work of the committee.
Any specific concerns about some of the evidence last week or any?
I think I'm conscious some members weren't here and didn't get an opportunity to ask questions, and some members have obviously raised issues around the amount of time they had asking questions.
Okay. I'm going to go to Hunt, I'm going to go to Sinn Féin. If one of you want to respond.
I do it.
Right.
Yeah, you all right, Emma?
Yeah,
So the nature of bringing all the ministers back would be what, in relation to questions that weren't answered at the committee about things in general, or?
Well, it's to do with the questions that were asked in relation to what they knew when around the McGonigal references, etc.
McGonigal.
Sorry, did I say that wrong?
Yeah,
McGonigal,
I'm
sorry.
sure Michael McGonigal is going to sue a lot of people.
I know, sorry. I was so conscious to get it right. But yeah, so it would be specifically in relation to that issue and the questions that were asked. Any thoughts?
So, so you either bring all back or you bring none back. You can't bring two ministers back.
Okay.
Because if that's the case, then we'll get the two ministers back from each of the parties, you know, for briefings on issues that would all like to raise. So I'd like to see legal advice on that.
Okay. Go ahead. Do you, P? Would you?
Yep.
You wrote.
Yeah. Well, look. Chair, as you know, I wrote to you and copied in the other members of the committee and the committee clerk requesting that, in particular, the First Minister and Junior Minister Riley be brought back, given information which has come to light and how this story has developed over the past week, and it has moved on substantially. I mean, at the meeting last week, essentially the First Minister was saying that this was the fault lay with two press officers who've been sacked or dismissed. And there were issues for the British Heart Foundation. And since that position articulated last week, it's got to a stage where the First Minister has publicly apologised to the British Heart Foundation, accepted the errors that her party made, and the Economy Minister, likewise, Conor Murphy, has associated himself with that apology and has accepted the Chief Constable's view that to have disclosed the serious child sex offences investigation would not have compromised any future trial. So that change in position has only come about through scrutiny. Scrutiny by this committee, by the media, by the Assembly. And I know there was the opportunity to ask questions in the Assembly, but you're now to ask one question. So this committee has the core responsibility to restore public confidence in those with responsibility to oversee safeguarding matters. And the First Minister is embroiled in a safeguarding failure and a safeguarding scandal. And we do have to act. This is the appropriate body to drill into this matter, to ask the questions. And they do, and I know our role is overseeing the ministerial posts, but it does extend into the political party as well, how people were employed, what measures were taken, who knew what, when. And frankly, there's issues around public credibility of claims that people were at events and didn't notice former colleagues being at it, both here at Stormont and at Westminster. So I do think we need that opportunity in the public interest. I want to take the politics out of it. I want us to, in our role as a committee, to undertake that scrutiny role.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Please.
I think, first of all, our primary concern has to be about safeguarding. And I think we have to remember who we are collectively. We scrutinise the work and hopefully support the work of the Executive Office. And that's the perspective I want to come at this. I wasn't here last week, but obviously, it was a developing, process. What occurred last week and the information we knew last week dramatically changed by Thursday. So, retrospectively, we could ask questions about that, particularly, around the British Heart Foundation. There was implication that they somehow had failed in their due diligence and their process. But what I want to do is restore our integrity, because the majority of the work that we do in here, we work about, we're going to take some briefing here on ending violence against women and girls. But we deal with the most sensitive of all issues. For example, historical child abuse. We take testament from people that have been victims of the most horrendous organisational and structural abuse of people. We are questioning the church and the state's role in all of that. And I feel we have lost a wee bit of our kind of moral duty until we get this resolved. We just need it resolved. We need our, we need to be intact and our credibility restored, and move on and do the good work that I believe this committee does in that area and speak up for victims and survivors. And that's the reason I think it's in everybody's interest, including the First and Deputy First Minister and the junior ministers, to get this cleared up and come back in here. And then let's move on with credibility and leadership and responsibility in relation to child safeguarding and victim safeguarding. And that's the only reason.
Okay, thank you. Timothy?
Thank you very much, Chair. Absolutely, I believe the First Minister and Junior Minister Riley need to come back to this committee. There's an onus on this committee to scrutinise and ask the questions. Some might think they're difficult, but that's the onus that's on this committee and on us as MLAs to ask them questions to get to the truth. There's a number of points to raise. Looking at the evidence last week when the First Minister was here, the First Minister said she didn't engage with anybody else apart from the family. So last Thursday, Friday, the photographs come out to say, or to clearly show that wasn't the case. At committee last week, I had put a question to Junior Minister Riley, and in that question it was to ask her what her engagement was with Michael McMonagle on the day, and was she claiming to have the same story as the First Minister. It's clear from the photograph that she was potentially even closer than the First Minister was. So on that basis, the evidence from the First Minister certainly is contradictory to the photographic evidence, and the shielding of the Junior Minister by yourself, Chair, and by the First Minister. We need to hear from the Junior Minister what her details were on that day. That question still hasn't been answered, and that's something that I think she needs to come to this committee, so we have the opportunity to ask her directly, not somebody else asking or answering on her behalf. I want to hear from her, because the question last week, as clearly set out in Hansard, was directed to the Junior Minister. As well as that, moving on to the ending violence against women and girls, I had raised the issue last week of the case of Maria Cahill, who was raped. And the First Minister responded, I would be really interested in this conversation if. And then she went on to make a personal slur against myself. So for the First Minister and Deputy First Minister to be leading up on the end in violence against women and girls and answering any question with using that as the introductory, I think gives discredit onto the strategy, onto what we're trying to do, the framework. And I think that this committee is the right place to bring her back to clarify them remarks. And if she wants to withdraw her scurrilous accusation against me when she's here, that would certainly be welcomed. But I believe this committee is the place to do it. And I think we need to be very careful of recess. So next week we're on the road. The week after that is the week before recess. We need to plan it in that we're bringing them back to this committee to answer the questions. We need some transparency, and there hasn't been any transparency to date. First Minister's reputation and that of the Executive Office is now in tatters because of that. And to me, it makes this document that they lead up also in tatters because of the credibility of the evidence she gave here last week. So there's a number of points she has to clarify, Junior Minister has to clarify, and I believe they need brought back to this committee to do it.
Okay. Claire, any thoughts?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, no, I think it's appropriate that the First and Deputy First Minister do come back before this committee. The First Minister responded to the Assembly earlier this week, and she was doing that in her capacity as the leader of the Executive. So that in itself gives appropriateness to our committee in terms of our direct responsibility in relation to this. I do think there are questions that need to be asked, further to what has been given in evidence at committee last week, but also in the chamber. And I suppose just to build on Sinead's point around safeguarding, which I understand does fall under the remit of the Executive Office. And the First Minister herself in her comments to the Assembly talked about that and how we need to take that forward in governance, so perhaps not just within political parties, but in the Assembly and in the Executive generally. So even from that, I think there's an opportunity to how we can move forward and improve things. And it has to be led by this. Something good essentially has to come out of this, and that's what I would like to bring back. I'm not particularly concerned about the junior ministers. I think the First and Deputy First Minister represent the office quite sufficiently themselves, but I've no difficulty with them coming back either.
Okay, thank you. One point I didn't make was that I asked the clerk to reach out to the British Heart Foundation earlier in the week to give them, not the right of reply, but an opportunity to come here, and they said they'd really just like to draw a line under it after they issued their statement. So just to let you know that that approach was made. I'm getting the sense that people feel that we should put the invite for all four to come back and to the private office. And are you saying they have 4 weeks to respond, similar to the... And then we would then, or do you think we should look at legal advice now?
Well, there are different proposals, I think.
Oh, sorry,
so there's
okay.
a proposal for legal advice there first.
So, Chair, just to clarify, so the legal advice I want in it is particularly around, so I've no issue with anybody getting called back. I just think it's either the 4 ministers or it's none. Because that just, for me, makes a mockery of the joint office. But it was particularly the proposals that Brian outlined, which for me are more about Michelle as a Vice President rather than the First Minister. So I want to get legal advice on that.
Okay.
And if there are unanswered questions when they're here, people are entitled to ask them. I'm not, it is about scrutiny. And I'm also clear about why questions are getting asked. So I want to get the legal advice on the callback. Should it be 2 or 4?
Okay.
And the legal advice on what issues pending from last week that they can answer. Because some of this stuff I think is starting to get a bit
Okay.
blurred.
Okay, so how long does it take to get legal advice back?
Take that long.
Get it turned around fairly quickly. I'd need to check with legal
Okay.
just to have a. I wouldn't want to commit them.
No, I know, but so after
Nice
Brian,
one.
so just 1 second, Brian, bring in. So last week after I received your email, I then phoned the clerk and I said, can you start some informal conversations with the DALO and also with the private office about this potential. So that did happen, but we just have to. We were waiting to see what was coming out of the committee today and stuff. So as soon as you literally, as soon as I got the email, I phoned the clerk. Did you want to come in again?
I just wanted to respond to Carol's points there. And I mean, I agree, it is going to be very difficult to take the party political aspect out of this because the two things are totally interwoven.
Okay.
I mean, McMonagle was employed as an MLA staff, yet throughout he's been described as a Sinn Féin press officer, including by Sinn Féin reps themselves.
Okay.
You know, so issue of his Stormont Pass, and on the back of this, could just make a final point. I mean, the Sinn Féin party leader, because of this issue, has now announced that she's going to conduct a fundamental review of governance within the party. You know, so this matter does extend into those party issues. But I understand that our role is an oversight role, scrutiny role for the minister.
I was advised some of that is actually Assembly Commission issues. So, go ahead.
Certainly, just following on from Brian, like this can't be limited to topics that were covered last week and may or not have been answered. This story has developed. This is about the integrity of the TEO office, and I believe it's this committee's right to ask some of them questions that may stray outside. Like last week I had asked regarding the references, I had asked within Sinn Féin had a paper, another question that was dodged, but I think it's the right of this committee to explore them questions, and as this story develops there may be more and more things come to the fore. We shouldn't be limiting already, we shouldn't be putting limitations on what members can ask. This is to scrutinise, ask the difficult questions, and it should be a case of setting the evidence session, dividing it up into time slots for each member to ask questions if they wish, so that when people are leaving this room that people feel as if we've got to the bottom of how this issue arose. And
Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to propose is if you can check out the legal advice, and I am going to ask you then, once you receive that, if we maybe even could call us back, even if it's not a Wednesday, like if we got it Monday or something, so we can move on as quickly as possible with this, and then we can make a decision then in terms of our next steps. Are people in agreement with that, or?
Yeah, just to clarify, the legal advice is for
Whether-
whether we should invite the 2 and the 4, and to ask about the rationale for calling them in terms of remit.
And you know, there's clearly questions that are being asked that have got absolutely nothing to do with TEO.
Well, I suppose.
So they're more commission related. So why?
credibility.
Well,
Credibility
that's
of the
your
first
opinion,
minister.
but I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the chair. So, Paula, that's the reason why I'm asking. I appreciate things will stray, but I think we need to be very careful about asking the First Minister to come in with the Deputy First Minister as part of a joint office to ask questions which quite clearly are probably more related to the Commission, to be frank. So,
Okay, I'm going to bring Claire in. Go ahead.
Thank
Claire.
you, Chair.
Nice and quick, please.
I
Thanks.
suppose in terms of the legal advice, can we clarify on what basis we legally can bring them back
Yes.
in relation to this issue?
Yeah.
Because my concern is if we bring them back on issues that we legally can't, then they have every right to say no.
Okay.
So I think the aim of this committee is to ensure we can get them in front of us,
Yeah.
and they will only do that on a legal basis. So I think we need to be clear about what we can ask them and what we can't. Otherwise, they're not going to appear. So
that's my point.
Okay. You want a second word, or are you fine?
Well, I would concur with what Claire has said. I think that we would do, as a committee, more damage if we don't have the clarity around what is possible. But again, as a committee, we need to think one thing first, and that is safeguarding and the interests of victims and survivors, because we
Absolutely.
spend a lot of time working on that area.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
Chair, just very briefly. I mean,
please, really briefly, because we have 3 panels to get through here.
2 brief points. I mean, first of all, it's about restoring public confidence.
Okay.
You know, and that's our.
That's,
And
that
secondly,
point to be made. Go
and
ahead.
secondly, just I mean, I think if we're writing, I think we should, as Timothy has pointed out in terms of recess, I think we should express a preference for Wednesday, 23rd of October, 2 weeks today, if possible, given that we're away next week on a visit to Ebrington.
Okay, we'll have a plan. Can you put that in writing to members then, so that we're all clear about what's happening? Okay, members, moving on very quickly. Draft minutes are in your pack. Any matters arising? True and accurate record? Happy for me to sign?
Chair. May I comment?
No, just on matters arising,
Yes.
Chair, I was going to ask if I could just propose that we write a letter to the Executive Office to say we're disappointed that we didn't get the briefing around violence against women and girls until about 12:15 today, and the committee was at 2, and it's very frustrating, and this isn't the first time this has happened, and it really does impede the work of this committee. I'm very conscious that other members were in this room at another committee meeting that finished a few minutes before this started, so
Yeah.
they would have had no opportunity to read this. So
That's right.
I think if we could write that and then we're in agreement, I would
In
appreciate
agreement,
it.
everyone? Yeah.
Agreed.
Go ahead.
Just taking you back to chairperson's business, there's 2 quick issues that I wanted to raise with you.
No. Chairperson's business is for me to bring.
Then it's
stuff.
matters arising if you
Okay,
wish
go
to put
put
it
it
on
like
that.
that.
So last Friday in the Nolan show, a presenter read out a statement which said that there was a press release had come from yourself.
Yes,
Um,
in a personal capacity. No, it didn't come. It came from the party, but it didn't come from this office, this committee.
that statement referred to you in your capacity of chair of the committee. So it did. To me, it came across from the Nolan show that it was issued on behalf of this committee.
In my capacity, I used that phrase, was in it?
Certainly the way it was portrayed by the Nolan show, it came across as if it
Well,
was
that's-
from this.
Yeah, it'll be better if you don't listen to that stuff.
I know,
you know.
I know.
Well,
Okay.
I would be of the opinion that if it came from your party or from you, that there is correspondence that goes from the party to the Nolan show to correct the record in that, because it certainly came across on Friday morning.
Well, that's
that
your
that was
interpretation.
with-
What's your next point? Because genuinely, we're going to move on.
So last week you read out correspondence at this stage and set a precedent, and in the correspondence this week there has been a letter sent to the clerk, and it's about yourself, Chair.
Yeah. And I'm going to stop. Can we put this in private session? Because I'm going to stop you right there.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30.
Do you know what you need to do? Pause a wee second, please. Pause. I think.
Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30, 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 sound.
Okay, sorry, I just have one other matter arising. So this morning, the Deputy Chair, Clark, and I met with the Commissioner Designate for Victims of Crime. You'll recall she wrote to me on the 11th of September, and that letter was copied to you. And she was calling for a rapid review of the racist incidents in the summer. So we discussed that this morning at our meeting. And given the evidence we have taken so far from the police, from the people with lived experience, from our own engagement around this issue, I was wondering if the committee would be in agreement that we would draft a committee motion to look at asking TEO to do a review into the events of the summer to include what happened, why it happened, who was involved, and what can be prevented, what can be done to prevent it happening in the future. And I'm just wondering, are we okay to get that drafted? Just because there's been no health committee at a committee motion this week. And Okay, so we're going to move on. Thank you for your patience today. So we're going to move on now to our Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategic framework, and departmental officials are here to give an oral briefing. So there's information in your pack, colleagues. So I'm just going to welcome to the meeting Claire Archibald, Geraldine Fee and Ryan Somerville, and they all are in the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Directorate within the Executive Office. And if you want to give a bit more explanation of your own roles, you can do that in your opening remarks. So over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just before I start, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the recent tragic murder of Mary Ward. And I'm sure that the committee would join me in extending our sincere condolences to her family and friends, and indeed to the families and friends of all the women and girls who have sadly lost their lives here. I'd like to thank you, Chair, and the committee for the opportunity to update you on progress on the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategic framework. With me today is Geraldine Fee, our Deputy Director, and Ryan Somerville, our Head of Policy and Research. You've received a briefing paper, and I'd like to give you our apologies that was late, which includes the strategic framework and the first delivery plan, which I hope arrived with you a little earlier, and will therefore be aware of the background to and the purpose and aims of our work. Today, we want to take you through the strategic framework and the first delivery plan in a little more detail, with a view to leaving as much of today's session for discussions and questions as possible. First, we'd like to thank the committee members and the range of community and voluntary sector organisations who have briefed the committee back in May. That input was very helpful in shaping the first delivery plan for the initial period of delivery. As you know, the Executive approved the strategic framework and the first delivery plan last month, and I'm pleased that the First and Deputy First Minister were able to publicly launch on the 16th of September, following a statement to the Assembly. I know that some of you spoke at the Assembly and that some of you were also able to attend the launch. This is a significant milestone in the programme of work, and I want to reiterate my thanks to everyone who contributed and who has enabled us to reach this pivotal stage. Moving on to the detail. You'll be familiar with the framework, which sets out a 7-year roadmap and describes the changes that are needed and the work that needs to be done to bring about an end to violence against women and girls. At its core are the 4 themes of prevention, protection and provision, the justice system, and working better together. The main update since we last spoke relates to the first delivery plan. This plan covers 2024 to 26, and the investment to support it will mobilise across sectors, it will build on existing good work, raise the profile and increase the understanding of this challenging issue, and it will be a catalyst for further delivery opportunities and future plans. The 2024 to 26 delivery plan will be supported by around £5 million, subject to future budget allocations. Community investment is key, and the Executive Office will invest around £3 million across the community and voluntary sector. Our Change Fund is a fundamental part of delivering the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategic framework, and it focuses on prevention. Design of the fund has been shaped by engagement with community groups and with key community and voluntary sector EVOG providers. For the Change Fund, £3 million has been allocated for the 24-25 and 25-26 financial years. Investment is scalable, subject to capacity and budget availability. It's anticipated that further funding will be made available for the remainder of the 7-year strategy, based on an ongoing review of needs. This Change Fund, in 2 strands, will enable grassroots community groups and community and voluntary sector EVOG organisations with expertise to expand vital on-the-ground projects and responses that raise awareness, build capacity to take action, and equip people to have safe and healthy relationships. Collaboration and innovation will drive improvement of frontline services. And for that reason, TEO will drive and support collaborative work streams involving departments, the community and voluntary sector, and wider society, which will identify and address key issues in their sectors, building on connections forged during development of the framework, and harnessing opportunities to mainstream EVOG and drive out any duplication. TEO has already secured £0.5 million of funding from the DFE Small Business Research Initiative to stimulate the development of private sector solutions to key EVOG issues. TEO will raise awareness through campaigns to provide information across society, whilst ensuring that there is strong, consistent messaging from our partner organisations. It is vital that everyone here, including our children and young people, understands the issue and knows how to help end violence against women and girls. Working better together is a key thread that runs throughout, and you will see that the delivery plan contains a number of opportunities to coordinate with partners and progress work in this important priority area of work. I say priority because you will also note that ending violence against women and girls is a priority in the draft programme for government, which cements the importance of this strategic and cross-cutting area of work. I hope that this has provided you with a flavour of the work that's now progressing, and we're happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Claire. Anything from your colleagues? No, not at this time. Okay, thank you so much. So I would very much concur with the Deputy Chair about the lateness of the report, and I'm glad you acknowledged that. But it was a very good report, and I was putting questions down, and then about a paragraph later then I got the answers, so I don't actually have that many questions, but thank you for that. It really did start putting meat on the bones. I suppose there's just a couple of areas where I would like a bit of insight from, and that's really about, in terms of those governance arrangements and the feed-in around healthcare professionals like GPs and midwives, you know, in terms of providing that support. I don't see much around how the health care sector will play a role in this ending violence piece.
So one of the things that we're doing in the first delivery plan is a gap analysis of frontline services, and that's really asking the question: if someone goes to their GP, if someone goes to the housing executive, if someone has an appointment with a community nurse, if there is an issue, what is their route into specialist services, and is it the same throughout? And what is the training in those sectors? we know that there is good work going on in the health sector. We also know that it is a huge sector. So we are looking at sectoral working groups.
Yes.
And the first groups that we are focusing on are obviously working closely with the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, with ending paramilitarism, folks with the victims and witnesses, folks in the Department of Justice, looking at the justice sector, looking at the safer socialising and the nighttime economy sector, which has been an early start.
Yes.
And looking at further and higher education. Health is on our list, but building those relationships and making sure that we've got all the players at the table to really make sure that we can do the proper deep dive into that is something which will be coming on stream, and we know that the first piece of work to deliver that is the gap analysis.
Good stuff, thank you. So just on that issue around the sectoral groups, and obviously South Belfast, I can sort of see where all of this work could fit into my constituency, and I'm glad you referenced that there's a rural aspect to this as well. But again, I think what has jumped out at me is the voices of young people, because you had that Queen's report there, it's just what happens, and obviously the young students, etc. So I'm just wondering how their voice is going to be represented and how they're going to be supported if they're not necessarily connected to a community group, for example, how young people will benefit from this strategy.
So we hope that young people will benefit in two ways. First of all, that they will be recipients and also co-producers of, for example, things that communities do when they get grants, or that they will be services will be available that will be working in education. But it's absolutely key that their voices are in this, that they are not just the object of concern, but that they are participants. That's why we did the research, but we also are working with the Education Authority, who have young forums of young people across this place in all of our counties, to put their views in. And for example, already they wrote the easy read version of our strategy at the early stage. Like Ryan wrote the first version, and then we put it to the young people, and they said, we don't like Ryan's version, here's ours.
Yes.
So sorry, Ryan. But, they had a day in this building where they looked at the sorts of things that they could do in their communities and in their groups. Now, the young people in those forums are in EA youth clubs. We're aware that not all young people are. So we're also working with groups who work with those young people so that they too can facilitate. I'm sure some of you were at the Women's Aid Young Victims and Survivors Vital Voices event a few months ago, and they've fed back information from that to us. But also we work with VOIPIC, with Rainbow. We work with Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network to make sure that when there is something that we need young people to do or say, for example, young people are giving us their input on a campaign which is coming up, which is focusing on bystander interventions, and we're reality checking that with them. So it's things like that. It's very practical. It's making sure that their voices are heard, and it's making sure that their voices then come through, and that when we hear striking testimony, that we're able to bring it into forums like this, because it's Lundy model. We don't just give them the chance to speak. We make sure that there is an audience and that we represent their voice and that it has an opportunity to influence as well.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to pass over to Deputy Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in today. I really appreciate it. The paper is really good. I learnt a lot. It's really good to see more detail on the Change Fund. I did want to ask you a wee bit more about that. In terms of the co-design partners, have they helped design the Change Fund? For example, what the criteria will look like, how the funding will be structured? Have they had input into that? And when do you foresee that launching? And how many projects do you think £3 million is going to cover?
So lots of good questions there. This is something which we are developing quickly. We're also aware that our co-design partners, we are engaging with them appropriately, but we're aware that some of them will be applying for grants. And we don't want to muddy the waters of, hey, would you like to design a scheme, and then would you like to apply under it? So we're trying to keep that clean. but we are also engaging with them. There's 2 strands to the Change Fund. There's strand 1, which is grassroots community grants, and there's strand 2, which is a regional reach scheme, where we're going to organisations with expertise and looking to, in the short term, I mean, this is a fast scheme to amplify work which they are doing, which there is good evidence for, and which could benefit even more people. So we have been going to them in that context. Strand 1, we hope, will roll out regionally with a good regional balance through councils, and we're talking to councils about that. And Strand 2, again, in partnership with Belfast City Council, we hope, and subject always to their views, but with regional reach. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. And timescales for when that'll be?
Timescales. We are aware that these timescales are stretching and challenging, but we hope that Strand 2 would be out before the end of this financial year, and that Strand 1 applications would launch within this financial year for award early in the next financial year.
Another one, or? No, we can move on. I'll come back for time.
Maybe come back if we've got time. Go ahead, Emma. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you all for the presentation, the briefing papers. I just wanted to ask around, I know you've outlined here that there's an outcomes-based accountability framework and that there's going to be a report twice yearly. Mm-hmm. And I know, I was pleased to see that an awful lot of the focus throughout the strategy is around changing attitudes and the fact that violence is based in attitudes, and that's where this comes from. And I suppose in the context where, at the outside of the meeting we had the chair make reference to the fact that we've found out just this week of another woman murdered in the north. How do we see that outcomes-based accountability actually working in real time in terms of measuring the success of this strategy when we're seeing the real impact of this day and daily here?
It's a really good question. Thank you for it. We are looking at 2, and Ryan is actually an escaped statistician, so keep me right on this, Ryan. But we're looking at measuring 2 different things. First of all, attitudes. And second, we would love to be able to measure prevalence, but that's really hard because it's so underreported and people often don't even recognise it. So we're using offending as a proxy for prevalence at this stage. We're looking at measuring at 3 levels. First of all, at project level, and that would be from projects that we run to, for example, a small community group that was running a grant proposal. We'd ask them to do something that was proportionate in terms of measuring their impact, and we would hope that because we have designed a set of common indicators, that those will be aggregable to measure at programme level, and then we will also have measures at population level, which will largely be from police statistics and from the community safety survey. Now, in relation to attitudes, we have already commissioned baseline research, those 2 reports which the Chair mentioned, and we have commissioned new data which will be asked on a rolling basis in the NILT and YILT surveys, the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey and the Young Life and Times survey, around people's attitudes, and we can tell you more about those questions if you want. We are also going to have data from partners, but NISRA remind us that the only things that we can rely on and publish for publishable indicators are official statistics, but the data from partners we believe we will find very useful internally, things like the amount of people using the helpline and the breakdown of who those people are and where they are. And the final thing I would say on that is just that our population level data, the attitudes will change slowly, so we don't expect to see the numbers changing this month or next month, but we do believe that based on advice from NISRA and based on international experience in other countries, that those measures give us a good indication, as good an indication as we can have, of the types of things that we're doing and of what's working.
That's great, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, Ryan?
I think I would just add that the OBA approach in terms of how much did we do, what's the impact and who's better off, that's really at that project level. in terms of the 14 actions, and I think that really allows us to be agile and to quickly learn from what has went well and to be flexible in that approach. And I think that's something we'll take then going into years 3 and beyond. So I think that's something to bear in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Sinead, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair, and thank you for your presentation and the work that you do. It's so valuable and so needed. And we've had our 4th femicide in 6 weeks in Northern Ireland. It's been pretty shocking, and 24 now since 2020. So it's urgently required. My concern is about the finance, and I've raised this before. And I know our finance is limited, and so we have to make the best use of the monies that we have in the system, and using the connections that we all have in our organisations and in our communities and that. But one area that I'm really concerned about is the finance of the PSNI in terms of their resources in and around that. About a couple of weeks ago, I had a meeting with Lindsay Fisher in and around the femicides that happened in my city and in Derry there. So it's only literally about 2 or 3 weeks ago that I met Lindsay, and she's really concerned as well. They're rolling out their new action plan.
Yes.
For the PSNI. But she said anytime there's a new piece of legislation that comes in and around any of this, it actually costs the PSNI about £1 million because there's training, there's capacity issues and all of that. And we do see some failures in the changing of the culture within, and it's not just the PSNI, we see it within multiple police forces throughout the UK in and around ending violence against women and girls. Just based on that capacity of our police force here in Northern Ireland, are you concerned that we can actually make inroads in a criminal justice system in order to deal with some of the major pieces of this here? When you look at 33,000 call-outs in domestic abuse and the impact that has in families and all of that, okay. I'm really concerned about it. No, I'm really concerned about it. So it's a wider approach. And how do you feel we can deal with it with very little money?
I think there's something positive and something negative that I want to say. What I want to say that's negative is that you're absolutely right. We have very little money to do this. And, we're not in the same position as some of our neighbours are. And in Dublin, their budgets are very different to our budget. And there may be work that we can do together, and that's something that we're actively pursuing at an early stage. We are... When we think about funding, we think about the funding that is required, and we think about what the TEO role is in funding. I think it's important that we don't duplicate funding, which is for another department, and that we don't displace funding. Otherwise, we're going to end up chasing decreasing amounts of money around the system. But I think that what we can do is make links, work together, and give the help that we can, even in terms of expertise, of sharing good practice, of amplifying the good work that goes on. And some of the work that Lindsay does, I must say, is very, very impressive, and the amount of work that she puts into it herself is also enormous. So I think that you're right, that some of what we can do is no cost and low cost. Some of what we can do in partnership with the community and the voluntary sector, and with other statutory and public sector organisations. But it is a large and complicated system, and making sure that we don't create any perverse disincentives in terms of funding is also really important.
Okay. Do you have another question?
No.
Yeah. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair.
Would it help Just to add something as well about governance, Geraldine.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the foot of what Claire was saying, just around the sheer breadth of this and making sure that we get to see an end-to-end picture of it. So the Oversight Board, which was set up really in shadow form when ministers weren't there, is now going to be chaired by the junior ministers, and the membership of that group is being expanded. It already contains permanent secretaries from most departments. It will now contain permanent secretaries or senior representatives if they have to delegate from all departments. But it will include representatives from the PSNI, the Prison Service, SOLAS, the Housing Executive. And I think that, that it's early days, but that provides a forum where we can take this holistic look at all of the various levers which a variety of departments and agencies are pulling. So we work closely with Lindsay and the PSNI and DSA, but everybody is trying to manage resources. But again, it goes to one of our key themes of working better together. And I think that overall forum of the Oversight Board with ministerial leadership and a programme board supporting that, and the twice yearly report to the executive gives us a vehicle through which we can escalate and elevate issues which maybe need executive consideration.
That's very helpful, Geraldine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I suppose it's occurred to me this week and other cases, but the criminal justice system is only useful insofar that people engage with it. So if we're trying to protect and prevent types of abuse or violence, we need to know they're in the system. To an extent, the statutory agencies need to have them in the system, otherwise they're not able to respond. I'm sure everyone around this table knows that within society and within communities there are perpetrators that have never really been held to account through the criminal justice system, whether it's because victims are scared to report or the case in itself has failed. How do we bridge that gap? Because I think that's probably one of the key aspects in tackling this, is that we can talk about ending violence against women and girls, but for maybe even in the case that we've heard of in recent days, there was previous. There is knowledge out there is intelligence, but it's not being used to the effect that we're actually saving their lives. So how, and that in that case they were in the system. So how do we bridge that? And I suppose that kind of brings us on to the knowledge within communities and people's attitudes. I spoke about what happened in recent day on social media. People don't recognise that we have a crisis, perhaps because it isn't happening to them, perhaps because it's such a hidden shame in all communities and backgrounds, that people are really resistant to say that Northern Ireland is not a safe place for women and girls, and it's not. And the statistics definitely show that. So how do we change those attitudes? And a last point as well is around the education of this. I think a lot of this can be tackled at the point in which people are growing up and what a healthy relationship is. Are we doing enough in schools? The Education Minister is really resistant to want to put RSE in schools. Maybe we call it something else. Maybe we don't call it sexual education. But what about healthy relationships? Because this is all about prevention. We have to deal with the bits when we get past that, but we're not going to prevent if people don't know what a healthy relationship is. And I'm really concerned that the current Education Minister doesn't even want to change that because he believes it's up to families.
Okay, so that was, I think that was three questions there. Do you want to pick them up then?
So you started out by asking, how do we make sure that people are in the system? I think I'd preface the remarks by saying there's two things we have to do. We take a public health approach, so it's not just calling the ambulance when somebody has a heart attack, it's making sure that people don't have a heart attack in the first place, and in the same way it's making sure that the services are there for victims and survivors, it's making sure that the criminal justice system has the confidence of our communities, but it's also about making sure that future generations don't have such need of those services. And I think that's the maybe unique focus of this strategy, that we're able to take that public health approach and look at the pipeline.
I suppose the point in that is, how do we protect people who have knowledge but don't have the legal system to back them? Yeah. So say one of my constituents had knowledge about someone who never found themselves within the criminal justice system, but everybody knows that they're a perpetrator. how are they protected even in libel law to make a disclosure or to protect someone else? Because we have the police saying to my constituents, they need to commit a crime before we can do anything about it.
Yeah. And there is also there's been a specific legal issue there which isn't within my remit. I'd say we're working very closely with the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy team. We're working very closely with the Ending Paramilitarism and Organised Crime team, and it's everybody doing that little bit more, everybody helping one more victim gets, it's I think it's a thing that has to be done one case at a time, and that we have to make sure that services are there and are supportive, and if they're not, we ask and we unravel each case, as the domestic homicide reviewers, for example, do. Mm-hmm. Our gap analysis is one measure that we can take. We know that there is more in the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy. We are helping them with a piece of work called My Justice Journey, which you may know about, which is making sure that when victims and survivors do decide to engage with the criminal justice system, that they have as much information as possible. And I think that there is no silver bullet for this. If this was easy, we'd already have done it. But it's also working with those very good community and voluntary sector partners and getting that information down into grassroots communities, so that people know. I think you're right to link it to information and education, because people knowing that the three things that we want our campaign work to focus on is, first of all, what is violence against women and girls, because, for example, while women may know in theory what coercive control is, they may not recognise that it's happening in their own relationship. The second thing is that people have the knowledge and the skills to enjoy safe and healthy relationships, and that's people of all ages. And the third piece is that women are safe and feel safe everywhere, women and girls. So that's the preventive piece, and those are the big messages. That's why we think campaign work is so important to this, but not just a single campaign, because you see an advertisement on a bus, it doesn't change your life, but that it's consistent, that it's strategic, that we're doing it with partners and organisations, so that people are seeing the same message again and again, and it's being reflected in different areas. Geraldine, would you talk about the education piece?
Yeah, just before I mention the education bits, we're also doing a bit of work in support of DOJ colleagues, and we're evaluating a pilot scheme which was run by Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid about support provided to people who are actually in the criminal justice system, in an attempt to stop the terrible attrition rates of people dropping out before something goes from charge to prosecution. So that work's ongoing, and I think that demonstrates how we intend to work with colleagues, because there's a whole department focused around justice, but we're trying to work collaboratively with them to put strategic effort into gaps or points which might help. On the wider point of education, we're working closely with colleagues in the education department and the wider education family, and it's the same sort of methodology which we're applying to sectoral work. So the aim is to bring together what we're styling at the moment anyway, a Healthy Relationships Forum, to bring together all of the key players. So again, we can look at this end to end. But that won't just focus on what people are taught in schools. What it will do is it will look at, well, what support is being provided to parents in the early years? Is there something more that can be done through Sure Start? What happens in reception classes and nurseries? The curriculum is only part of what happens in a school, because sometimes that behaviours are not carried through in school, and that will move the whole way through. I mean, I think the age we're looking at is when somebody would end, say, formal engagement with the youth service, but we're also taking that out into youth and community. So it will be a very, very broad forum. And the intention is, as with all these sectoral groups, that we will work together and devise an action plan, and that then that action plan will have actions and measurable targets and commitments from all of those involved. What this isn't a one and done type issue. It needs behaviours and attitudes for them to change. They need to be reinforced everywhere you look. And the really important thing is that messages at home, messages in school, messages in your youth club, that all of those reinforce the attitudinal and behavioural change we need.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Timothy, please.
Thank you very much for coming along. Just want to pick up, so page 29, I think it was 49 of the pack. It says in relation to schools, further developing in collaboration with young people the design of relationship and sex education, which is accessible, inclusive and age and developmentally appropriate in the context of changes to mandatory consent. You're aware of the highly controversial nature of some of those changes. Can you explain the role of the Executive Office in relation to them?
So can you just refresh my memory on what changes, is this the Secretary of State's changes in relation to abortion content?
Well, it's 2.2 in schools, and I'm reading a paragraph, and that's really what I'm trying to bring out of yourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, Geraldine.
Well, I think, I've outlined what our role will be. Our role is working with education providers and convening that group and looking at what best practice is.
Yes.
And we're not there to usurp the role of other departments, but we will be there to provide EVOG expertise and a lens in that environment. The intention of that forum is to ensure that young people can have health and safe relationships. It's much wider than RSE. It's much wider. It's about how people behave, what they expect of behaviours, all of those attitudes. So I think you shouldn't look at that in a narrow lens. It's much more expansive than that.
Will that take into account parents from a family unit that feel that they should be the ones deciding what their child is exposed to?
Well, as I said, we're keen to work with the education providers, but we have also, and I think we've demonstrated this through, we've worked through, we want to work with parents, we want to work with governors, we want to work with young people, we want to work with youth workers, because this is not doing things to people, it is working with them to work out the best method of delivery and how we bring this issue forward. We will be supported by an insights and reference network, building on the co-design group that we are that successfully piloted the development of the strategy through. So everything which we do will have reference to lived experience and to those working in particular sectors. There will then need to be an action plan coming from that group, and the Department of Education and those with the statutory remit in the particular areas will be involved in the delivery of that.
This morning I met with the Women's Right Network, and they raised concern that within this document there is no definition of what a woman is. Is that deliberate? Can you set out what the Executive Office, what the definition of a woman is in the Executive Office? And can you show me where that's listed anywhere?
So this relates to a question that you've asked before, I think. Our focus is on prevention and tackling the root causes of violence against women and girls. The problem is the violence and the intention to hurt. So it's that intention that we think should be our focus.
Well, is there a definition of what a woman is in the Executive Office?
There isn't a definition. There isn't a definition I think you'll find commonly in government documents of ordinary words in the English language.
Document is talking in language of gender rather than sex. On page 48 of the document, it talks about co-design partners. Would you describe any of those critics of modern gender theory? If not, is that an omission by the department, and will you commit to engaging with the Women's Rights Network going forward?
We can come back to you on the contact that we've had with the Women's Rights Network so far, if that would be helpful.
And if you haven't had any contact with them, is that a commitment you're willing to make, that you will engage with them going forward?
see who the members are, and I think we've had contact with most people who have views in the field in Northern Ireland. So it'll be good to see who's in that space and whether there's a gap there.
I'm going to move on because I didn't get the committee chair, deputy chair come in. I've still got Brian, Harry, and then Carol, please.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. And this is really, I have to say, I think it's an excellent document from the vision to the concluding comments. And I want to acknowledge the work from the officials and the co-design partners putting this together. I think the document itself is very educational for people, and especially the part Timothy was referring to on healthy, respectful relationships, which is at the core of this. I'm interested in section 2.3, the role of youth and community supports organisations, which do a lot in shaping, particularly for men and boys, their attitudes, and in those more informal settings, and the promotion of healthy, respectful relationships. To me, first of all, we have to acknowledge the problem, and we do have a stark problem in our society of violence against women and girls. And for every appalling murder, and sad, there has been a shocking number. Sadly, there will be hundreds of other incidents where there has been violence. And I think we all have to acknowledge this is a problem in our society that everyone has to address, and particularly men and boys. And in terms of reach and delivery, so for smaller, say some of those, what's referred to there, sports groups, cultural groups, youth organisations, how could they participate in this strategy? So the leaders there mightn't have the ability to deliver a session, but they might be willing, and it might be just one session, or it might be two, an appropriate group to come in and work with them, and not, to do it appropriately, not just in a PowerPoint. It needs to be an engaging exercise that young people, and to challenge themselves and to think, and about language and about how we talk about people, and how men and boys talk when they're together about women, and for everyone just to reflect on that. So how would you see that to ensure there's that reach out to groups that are very influential?
That's exactly why the Change Fund is being delivered in partnership with councils. We hope. We obviously have to make sure that all of the councils are content with that. But the idea of regional reach and of working with people who can reach right down into the grassroots, to the small sports clubs and the youth clubs and the organisations like that. We hope that our Strand 1 of our Change Fund, it's tiered. It can include very small grants of money. It welcomes bids from consortiums. So if a sports club wanted to get someone in from the community and voluntary sector with expertise to, for example, train their coaches, if they wanted to get someone in to do a session with their members, if they wanted to run a little project, that's exactly the sort of thing. We say there's something everyone can do, and we would hope that violence against women and girls isn't a women and girls problem, it's a problem for everyone, and that everyone will find a way to get involved and to particularly to influence boys and young men to be the best that they can be in this space. Is there anything else, Geraldine?
I was just going to add that we are hoping to commission a piece of research about attitudes amongst men and boys in the Northern Ireland context, so that we know more, because the point we've always made in this strategy is that men and boys need to be allies in this, and that it's very important then that we understand patterns of thinking and work with men and boys as we move forward. So we hope to commission that research this year.
Certainly, that's how I'll judge it, how that reach, in the community. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Harry, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. First of all, good to see you, I should say. I was very pleased with Lindsay Farrell's first comments. Schools are very well placed to lead the way on attitude and behaviour and change. I thought that was very good. I mean, schools and early learning years while it's great to be teaching the children, it's also two-way street. So you'll find that there'll be a lot of information flow back. That'll be very useful there as well, I thought. There was one thing, if you don't mind me saying, where I was slightly disappointed because I seen, the role of men and boys, thinking that would be a huge role, or because we are the problem as such, But I was kind of disappointed that there was just 11 lines and 2 chapters, although it's tied in the rest. I thought it should have been maybe more role for men and boys.
I think it's not to say that we don't see a role for men and boys, but that this is a whole of society approach, and we wouldn't. When there are things that we want people to do in their own lives, there's, for example, a campaign that we have coming up in conjunction with some of the other big statutory providers is going to be looking at bystander and at the active interventions that people can safely make when they see poor behaviour, not just when they see violence, because it may not be safe to intervene, but when you're in the golf club or when you're down at the pub and somebody is behaving in a way that they shouldn't, ways that you can use your influence as a man or a boy of goodwill. And I think that things which are individual and things which are whole of society, we can suggest and we can encourage, and we hope that you would use your leadership to do the same, but we can't tell and we can't demand. And I think that people from this part of the world particularly don't like being told what to do. No. So, but we think there's lots of good things that people can get on board with.
And I think we've seen some evidence of that already, because we work closely with the Labour Relations Agency. But we know that the Labour Relations Agency recently ran an event on male allyship in the workplace, and that was really well attended. And they also had male representatives from each of the Northern Ireland departments. So I think that message is already getting out there, and we're seeing what we wanted to happen, of sectors actually lifting this themselves and moving it forward, and us working in collaboration with them.
And again, we would hope that Strand 2 of our Change Fund, which will give those organisations with expertise in these things more scope to do their work, that they would be able to go out and influence even more community groups and even more groups of men and boys to play their part.
Yeah. Very good, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Carol?
Thank you. I just want to support what others have said about the late papers. It's really important work, and we're literally trying to skim through it, and it's just not appropriate.
No, we appreciate that.
What I want to ask is, there are 2 questions. In relation to private sector solutions, small business research initiative, is that going out to the community and voluntary sector or to a small business within the private sector?
So that's going out to the community and voluntary sector as well, and specifically we're asking our co-design partners and the people who'll be in our insights and reference group to publicise that, because we think that some social economy groups will be very well placed to participate in that.
So in relation to SIB, it says that SIB are managing the competition on behalf of TO.
Mm-hmm. So that, the SBRI is a ring-fenced fund which is run by SIB on behalf of the Department for the Economy, but the funding, it's a Innovation UK scheme, so that we are tapping into an existing structure and an existing methodology, but we have designed those challenges with our stakeholders, so they're very much our challenges, but the structures and the infrastructure for rollout is something which already exists, which is fantastic.
So what involvement do SIB have in terms of this overall strategy?
So they have involvement in a number of ways. First of all, in relation to the SBRI, that's a plug and play. Mm-hmm. We have also required, when we started this work, we knew that we would need some special support, particularly in comms and in data. And we have been fortunate to have, when we were unable to source the level of specialism required through recruitment or internally from the civil service, the next port of call then in the playlist is to go to SIB, and we've been very fortunate in the people that we have got to play those absolutely pivotal roles.
I mean, this isn't any criticism of SIB, it's just that they're more expensive.
They are, but on the other hand, they're more effective than nothing, which was the alternative.
I know, but the issue is that the community groups are frankly going to scramble here. And I just think it's not a good example that the department's setting by, accepting that SIB at this stage is just the only option. I think you need to go back and look centrally, because I just think the pot is small enough, and the figures for SIB are probably twice that of civil service.
We'll go back to you with those figures, because I think that's not quite the case.
Well, if you could, because I prefer just to have it completely clarified. So what I would like to know is how much money has been spent on SIB from the initiation of this project, and where it's been spent, and the rationale for the spend, please. I appreciate there was no government. I appreciate that this department, or this initiative, was being launched, but I don't think you can stand over that now.
And I think the other thing that I would want to draw to the committee's attention is that there have been difficulties in across the civil service in recruiting sufficient numbers of staff, particularly at those senior working grades from which you would be looking for this type of expertise, and that simply getting people to do the work and getting people to do the work at a particular standard is very difficult at present.
No, I hear what you're saying, but if you could provide those costs, I think the committee would appreciate it. Thank you.
Can I just add one to it? Because I picked up on that as well, Carol, and it was that TEO then appointed SIB, who then appointed Centre for Procurement Excellence. So it's just that it's in your paper we got today, and you said that TEO had provided some money to, I think, cover this. But again, I very much concur that we don't want to be spending a lot of money on consultants. I just don't understand why there are 3 players along this route, and it's probably just.
And is this in relation to the SBRI?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in relation to SBRI, that is a plug and play that runs. That is the system through which that runs.
Okay. But again, it just seems like there's just layer upon layer in terms of this, and from my previous background, very much concur that it's an expensive model in terms of procurement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is it's not the TEO model, it's the DFE model, and we buy into that, so we would need to get probably part input then from DFE on that.
Just to be clear, what I'm asking for is the total spend on SIB. And then this model is an addition to that. Like, there's 3 sets of processes for the costs associated. So I would like to know, the total spend of SIB from the department to SIB from the initiation of this project. Just to be clear.
Okay. Connie, did you answer the question?
Mine was answered in the course of the questions. So
okay,
don't worry.
thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks to all the committee members for keeping their questions succinct today. And but I suppose there may be some other questions if they are able to send them through to you that maybe they didn't get to today. Is that okay, Claire?
Yes, definitely.
Well, thanks again. Please do keep us posted on progress of delivery.
We will.
Thank you.
And thank you for your interest.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, members, again, thank you for cooperating there in terms of brevity.
Chair, I'm going to need to excuse myself. I need to make a personal phone call.
No problem.
Chair, apologies. Just want to ask before the panel leave. In terms of the biannual updates, will we receive those then? I take it, and might you come in then after each biannual update? It would be useful so we can monitor the progress.
That's the role of this committee. That's
okay.
Good. Good. Okay, so moving on then, members, we've got our next oral briefing, and it's on mother and baby institutions, and it's around the donation of bodies for anatomical research. So we have a briefing from Queen's University Belfast. In your table pack there is a briefing paper from the Diocese of Down and Connor. I just want to advise you that the diocese asked to come to the meeting a meeting of this committee. However, they were unable to attend on this date. They have instead sent that briefing paper, but we may wish to revisit that. Okay, so if we can have our next panel in, please. Thank you. Thank you.
We don't know how long.
That end up there.
That's crazy around the body.
Oh, aye.
Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Okay, members, so we have Professor Alan Smith, who's the Dean and Head of School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Sciences from Queen's, and Alistair Finlay, Associate Vice President, brackets, Operations and Special Projects at Queen's. You're both very welcome today, and I appreciate you may have some colleagues in the gallery, and apologies for the delay. We just had quite a lot of business to get through today. So, gentlemen, would you like to make some opening remarks?
I will, if I may.
Yes.
I've got quite a lot to get through, so I hope you'll bear with me, but I think I can hopefully anticipate some of the information that will be needed and put it in context.
Okay. I think you have the right, because we have raised this before committee, so if you want to get through it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be as succinct as I can.
Thank you.
So I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to meet with you today and provide some information about anatomy teaching at Queen's University, and particularly our body donation programme. I've been in post for a year as Dean of the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Sciences. I'm a clinician, I'm a paediatrician, so I look after sick children and I do research in child health. I want to reassure you and colleagues that our interests in this matter are shared: truth, transparency and accountability. We're working to provide a full and detailed record of the donation of bodies for anatomical examination at Queen's University. And we're engaging openly and in a spirit of cooperation with all stakeholders, including the Committee for the Executive Office. In this statement, I will describe legal regulations which were in practice from a previous era. These are very different from our practice today. Some of the terminology I use may not be comfortable for the layperson. So, for example, I'll talk about anatomical specimens. That's the correct terminology. Our current body donation programme at Queen's University allows donors to give consent in life for the use of their body after death, both for teaching and research. Consent for anatomical examination is governed by a series of Acts of Parliament that stretch over 200 years. These are, first of all, the Anatomy Acts 1832 and 1871, the Anatomy Order Northern Ireland 1992, and the Human Tissue Act 2004, which came in 2006. The Anatomy Acts of 1832 and 1871 empowered the executor in lawful possession of the body of a deceased person who had to allow the body to be used for anatomical examination unless the deceased person had stated to the contrary or unless a family member objected. And this requirement to opt out applied equally to the rich and to the poor. It's analogous to the current rules on organ donation, which require an opt-out rather than an opt-in. The subsequent legislation relating to body donation, both the Anatomy Act Northern Ireland 1902 and the Human Tissue Act 2004, require the deceased person to have given consent in life for the use of their body for anatomical examination after death. In each era, we believe that Queen's University has adhered to the legislation at the time. The Anatomy Act that governed our practice for 150 years required an anatomy inspector appointed by the Home Office to approve each body donation and document this with an anatomical return form. These are government records, not university records. Colleagues at Queen's have approached Public Records Office for Northern Ireland and also the Department of Health, but neither have been able to locate these anatomical return forms. Prior to 1921, the forms were sent to Dublin, and we have been able to locate a number of anatomical return forms relating to Queen's University in Dublin in the National Archives of Ireland. And we've committed a member of staff who has viewed these records, and we've made a request for copies of the records that relate to bodies that were sent to Queen's to be copied and sent to us. We also plan to appoint a postdoctoral researcher to study the history of anatomy teaching in Belfast, which goes back to the early 19th century, to help us understand the changing social attitudes over that period of time. Since 1927, Queen's University has trained 12,000 doctors to provide healthcare to the residents of Northern Ireland.
and in total 2,464 donors have given their body for anatomical examination over that period of time. During the dissection process, these bodies are treated with dignity and respect, and it's part of the teaching that our university provides for medical students, which emphasises respect for the individual before and after death. After dissection, the donor's remains are either returned to the family for burial, if that's what the family have requested, or the university will cover the cost and arrange burial or cremation. And historically, many of these donors and their families would have struggled to meet the cost of a burial, were the university not prepared to cover this. As well as teaching, some of the bodies donated to Queen's University have been used for anatomical research. And this has led to important new knowledge that improves human health. Just to give you one example, research conducted at Queen's has helped us understand the best way to administer a regional anaesthetic, that's a nerve block, for a surgical procedure such as total knee replacement. About 15% of these procedures are done as an outpatient, so nerve block being the only pain relief available. And nerve block is also used after a general anaesthetic to provide post-operative pain relief. So this kind of work, 100,000 people will have a knee replacement in the UK every year. So this kind of work could save the NHS money, could improve the patient experience, and lead to more outpatient procedures. Queen's University holds donor files going back to the 1980s, containing consent forms and other documentation relating to the donor. And the current legislation governing consent is the Human Tissue Act 2004, and that requires that consent forms and other donor details are retained until the body is either buried or cremated. Where the body has been used in research rather than teaching, it is our university requirement that we keep consent forms for 5 years after the research has been completed. The Human Tissue Act and the Anatomy Order of 1992 allow the retention of anatomical specimens to enable teaching over a longer period of time, and we request specific consent for this. Such consent was assumed under older legislation. Other records maintained at Queen's University are in the form of 2 anatomy logbooks. Logbook 1, 1927 to 1982, Logbook 2, 1982 to 2003. These provide an enduring record of bodies received and the arrangements for burial and cremation. These logbooks were also used to help anatomy technicians coordinate teaching in the department, so they say which table a body is located on, for example. For over 20 years, we've backed up our paper records with a digital record, which is secure and accessible, and we've now transcribed all our paper records going back to 1927 into digital form, and we'll soon be moving to a new digital platform which will support our active donor register and our historical records. And this will link to digital versions of paper forms such as consent forms and, we hope, grave papers. During the COVID pandemic, our body donation scheme was suspended. This was the first time this had happened since the early 1800s. In May 2023, we initiated a further pause because we had issues with staff sickness. We couldn't support the body donation programme, and we renewed that pause in May 2024. When I took up my post, I commissioned an external review of anatomy teaching with an appraisal of all options, including prosection, which is the use of specimens that have been prepared by anatomy teachers and shown to students rather than students dissecting themselves, and also digital methods. The review was carried out by 2 distinguished anatomists, Professor Tracy Wilkinson from the University of Birmingham and Professor Fabio Quando-Matteo from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland in Dublin. They submitted the report in April of this year, and it recommended that we restart the body donation programme, so preparations for this are in progress. We've also visited colleagues, University of Ulster, for example, to view their digital anatomy teaching systems, and we've met with the University of Southampton, who use prosection to take advice. When dissection is complete, bodies which are to be buried or cremated by Queen's are either sent to Belfast City Cemetery or Roselawn Cemetery. And since 1927, we've arranged the burial of 1,155 bodies of donors and have arranged cremation of 1,010 bodies. 1 body was returned to the family before dissection. 6 donor bodies are currently undergoing dissection. In 292 cases, we have no record of either burial or cremation, and we believe these bodies were returned to the family to make funeral arrangements. However, we can't be sure. This is because some records the records that exist comprise a mixture of notebooks, logbooks, and grave papers, and some have been lost over time. The missing records are the older ones. For the last 40 years, we have complete records of the destination of the body after dissection. We received body donations from private addresses, nursing homes, most hospitals in Northern Ireland, including 64 from the Royal Victoria Hospital, 166 from Belfast City Hospital, and 451 from Belfast Union Workhouse, which later became Belfast City Hospital in 1948. In previous evidence, this committee has been told that 1,980 remains were used by Queen's University, and 1,824 of those are outstanding, meaning that we don't know what happened to the remains of those people. As I've said, in 292 cases, we have no record of either burial or cremation. We believe these bodies were returned to the family. I can find no evidence to support the claim that the whereabouts of 1,824 bodies is unknown. We're in the process of appointing an archivist, the interviews were this morning, and establishing a searchable record of body donations received by Queen's University. We plan to link the dissection records, which have now been digitised, with the grave papers held by the two cemeteries. We hope that this will lead to more information on the 292 bodies where we do not know whether they were buried or cremated, so a grave paper may exist where burial or cremation wasn't entered in the logbook. From 1927 until 1973, the university received the bodies of 49 children, mostly infants under a year. In the period from 1927 to 1962, we received the bodies of 5 infants from Thorndale House, a mother and baby home in Belfast, run by the Salvation Army. 3 of these 5 infants were buried. For the remaining 2, this is not recorded. These are the only body donations which the university has received from mother and baby homes. Queen's University is currently progressing with plans for memorialisation of our donors. We plan to have a memorial and information about the scheme available both at Belfast City Cemetery and at Roselawn. We've made an initial request to Belfast City Council, and we want to co-design these memorials from inception with those involved in the programme, including the donors and their families, who deserve our acknowledgement and gratitude. We plan the widest possible consultation. We will also involve students and teachers. We will also have a memorial at Queen's University to serve as a reminder that teaching through dissection is only possible through the altruism of donors. And finally, we plan an annual university ceremony where students, staff and families can commemorate and thank donors. In previous evidence, this committee has been told that 44 children in an unnamed children's residential institution were subjected to a drug and vaccine trial in 1962. We think the trial in question was published in The Lancet in 1962. The authors were 6 members of the microbiology staff at Queen's University and a paediatrician from Belfast City Hospital. The trial looked at adding an activated polio vaccine to the routinely used diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis vaccine. The infant participants were aged between 6 and 19 months, and the paper records that 9 of 44 infants were residents of a children's home, without stating which one. All the children remained well and developed good immunity to polio. If this paper were published now, it would be required to state what ethical approval was given to allow the trial to take place, and how informed consent was requested and obtained. These requirements did not apply in 1962, and there's no record in the paper of what ethical approval or consent was obtained. Queen's University holds no further records relating to this work. Queen's University has worked with a number of parties to provide information about our body donation programme. On the 21st of May this year, we met with the Truth Recovery Independent Panel, chaired by Professor Leanne McCormick, and provided them with information about the programme. We also had a helpful suggestion from Mark Farrell, who's a panel member and archivist, that we should contact the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin, and indeed we have done, and that was really useful. We have responded in full to several Freedom of Information requests, and we have provided our logbooks to the Police Service for Northern Ireland. They have now returned those logbooks to us, and they are located in a dedicated safe in a climate-controlled area of the Special Collections Room in the Maclay Library. They have been backed up in digital format. We plan that these digital records will be used to provide information to members of the public who wish to know whether a family member was part of the Queen's University Body Donation Programme and where that family member is buried. We hope this information is helpful to the committee. We're happy to answer questions from the committee, and if we don't know the answer, we can take these questions back and discuss with colleagues and respond to you. We will, if the relevant information exists, we will answer the questions if we can. And I want to thank you all for your attention today.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive report. I think there's probably a wee bit more detail in that than what we got in our submission, is there? So if we can share that.
Very happy to share this.
Okay, thank you. So this committee, we're really focused in on the donations for mother and baby institutions, workhouses and laundries. So can you just clarify again how many bodies you believe have come forward? And I'm talking about in the context of the report in the Times in July 2021 around the Freedom of Information request from Mr. Ewan Duffy, around 27 bodies. Is that correct? Were donated?
No, so in terms of mother and baby homes, we've received 5 bodies, and all from the same mother and baby home. That's Thorndale House.
That's what I thought you said. But why? What is that? What was that Freedom of Information request about then 3 years ago? What were those 27?
Well, I don't think that information came from.
We've provided a large number of responses to Mr. Dovey to a variety of different questions, so they're over quite an extended period of time, and then had very detailed engagement with him, because rather than do the transactional freedom of information piece, we actually arranged a whole series of meetings to try and answer as much as we could his information. We're happy to review anything that has been provided and see if that has been misinterpreted or what. It very often will depend on the specifics of the actual question about how we've responded to that. But if there is ambiguity in the data, we will sort it out.
Okay, thank you. I want to pick up on the memorialisation piece, and I'm glad you have reached out to the Truth Recovery Panel. And I suppose from this committee's point of view, when we support victims and survivors of historical abuse, you know, we feel that they really have to be at the centre of the decision making and the planning, the co-design, etc. of that process. And it doesn't really strike me that that's what your process that you've laid out. It is quite perfunctory, but I'm not sure. Okay, and could you maybe speak to what other universities have done in terms of ensuring that victims and survivors are at the centre of their memorialisation programme? Thank you.
So our work in this is just beginning,
okay.
And I think this is one of the most important parts of what we will do. From my own experience, in another context, I've worked with patient groups and clinicians actually to determine the questions that should be used for research. And I think in those forums where you've got the professional and the layperson, it's really important to make sure every voice is heard.
Yes.
And equal value is given to the comments and opinions from lay colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I don't profess to be an expert in public engagement, but from that background, I'm actually absolutely passionate about doing it properly in the research setting, and I would bring the same determination to do it properly in the setting of memorialisation, because this is a gift. This comes from altruism, and were it not for this gift, we couldn't train those 12,000 doctors. So we are only beginning this journey, but I think it's absolutely important that we get it right.
Yeah, and there's no doubt, like, it is an amazing medical school. Obviously, it's in my constituency, so I have utmost respect for the work in this space, but it's just this particular aspect of it.
Yeah. Chair, yes, I was just going to say we're aware of a number of medical schools that have forms of memorialisation, generally at the site of the medical school.
Yes.
We're a bit different, in so much as we have done this research. We're looking at with Belfast City Council. We can see the plots that university has used over time, and we now need to move into a better memorialisation in those sites. Yes. And we've had that initial introduction with Belfast City Council. What we now need to do is to engage in a consultation process, in the widest consultation process, in order to get the most informed way forward. That's the most appropriate way of undertaking that recognition, and also offering explanation about the body donation scheme and how it is operated.
Okay, thank you. I suppose just before bringing the Deputy Chair, there's some really experienced facilitators who are employed by the Arts Council who are very good at this piece of work. So it's just a bit of advice. Go ahead, Connie, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in today. It's obviously a very difficult subject for many people, and this committee has heard evidence previously. And I think I just want to go back to the figure that this committee was told: the 1,824 bodies. Effectively, they don't. That we were told that we don't know where they are. Would you be able to speak a bit more to that, and maybe just explain further about what your evidence on that would be?
So I can't speak to where that particular 1,800 figure came from. I do know that the Freedom of Information requests result in piecemeal release of information, because that's the way Freedom of Information works. It has to be manageable chunks. But we've looked at all the data for those 2,500 odd donations from 1927 onwards, and the 292 figure I gave you is the number where we don't know the destination of the body, and we would seek further documentation to help us with that. I can't say where the 1,800 figure came from.
What we can say is there's a big missing chunk of information, and that is the returns that went to the anatomy inspector. What we see from our colleague who went down and looked at the anatomy inspector returns that are in the National Archives in Ireland, so pre-partition, you can see what we would expect to see all the way through up for Northern Ireland that we're seeing. It's not a complete set that's in the National Archives, but you can see the full set of documentation, including the death certificate. Because remember, we only are receiving bodies that have a death certificate, and there should be a full document set. And that was held by the anatomy inspector. That was their role. The anatomy inspector was at the centre of the initial legislation, and it went all the way up until we had the Human Tissue Act come in. And PRONI have been unable to help us with that, and the Department of Health have been unable to help us with that. So there's a big chunk of missing information, but it was not information that we would hold, because our responsibility was to give that to the anatomy inspector, and the anatomy inspector had to inspect the premises, as the Human Tissue Act requires the premises to be licensed, so did the previous legislation. There was a licensing and regulatory regime in relation to the premises and the people operating in it, and there's a big gap.
Thank you. In regards to the figure, you have 292 bodies where you effectively don't have information for what happened. Can you just remind me again what the timescales were for those, and if you don't have the Queen's done any work to try and engage with those families, who I'm sure many of them, if this is known to them, would be very distressed?
So the denominator for that is from 1927 until the present day, but in fact in the last 40 years we can account for the destination of every body.
So it's large, it's more historical. More work would have to be undertaken, triangulating potentially death certificates or other certificates that will be in the registration of birth, death, marriage, etc., back with the information that we have, and then potentially triangulating with layer certificates or certificates that the councils may have, if indeed it was in Belfast. So that to get the answer to that requires a lot more joining up of information that is in other domains.
And that's what our archivist would be employed to do.
Okay, move on one more. Would the memorialisation plans you have, would that take into account, and will that recognise and acknowledge that there is missing data, and there are a number of people you don't know what happened to their remains?
I think that's a really important point. And I think it would have to. So we haven't worked out all, we're just beginning on the pathway of memorialisation, but no, that is a really important point that we would have to acknowledge.
Okay, thank you. Carol, please.
Thank you. So when I read the memorialisation piece, it's just that you appreciate there were figures given about the number of bodies that is actually different. You're saying there's 5 deceased children that came from Thorndale House.
Yes.
But yet no, we have had other figures, so it's important for us to actually get to the facts. So until you said that, I just have to say I balked at the idea of it says, about the memorialisation piece about thanking and being grateful to donors, when up until you've clarified that, we thought the people who died in the mother and baby institutions, the workhouses, or the Magdalen laundries, their bodies were donated without their consent. So how's that going to be reflected in memorialisation?
Well, I think there's part of that would involve the consultation process. That how is that reflected? But it reflected the legislation at the time. It reflected how the rules operated. So for an institution, so as Alan mentioned, the previous legislation, it was implied that consent was given unless there was an objection, and it had to be quite an explicit objection, either from the person when they were alive or from their immediate family.
So we know that.
Yes.
So I still think that the way that the memorialisation is laid out in that paragraph needs to reflect that, because it implies that consent was given and it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think this can be reflected and consulted upon and we will listen as to what those impacted and affected feel that memorialisation should reflect. It reflects a lot of societal change over a period of time.
I appreciate that.
And we collectively will maybe acknowledge that society at that time operated in a way which didn't maybe value life the same way as we maybe value it today, and maybe we reflect back on that history in terms of looking backwards. Was that the best reflection? Was that the best approach at the time? We'll take all that into account when we're talking about memorialisation and what the different views are as to how we should remember. In some cases, with sadness, and other people who are, the modern body donation programme, where there are people looking to proactively donate their bodies and as a positive act.
No, look, we understand the difference, and I know you understand the difference as well. But as this process goes on, and families don't talk about these things, they don't talk about their young sisters or daughters or grannies getting sent to a Magdalen laundry, so-called, getting hid away in an institution to have a baby, but by and large, for the best part, was forcibly removed and adopted. Some of those babies didn't survive, some of those women didn't survive. Mm-hmm. And as this process goes out, I just am asking that while there were differences in approaches and in legislation of the time, it doesn't prevent us from being sensitive or reflective of how those women and their babies were treated. And I think it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't take it.
We will, of course, take that opportunity.
Thank you.
Absolutely. What could help, actually, is if we could find some of that missing data. So if we could have found the forms relating to the anatomy inspector, that would provide us more information about the circumstances. It's not going to provide exactly what that you mean. The form might actually look as though someone has given permission, but arguably you might have said they might have been coerced, it might have been forged. Who knows the circumstances around about that? We've got to take all of that into account, but we will, of course, reflect all of this with great humanity.
I appreciate that.
The other take home from that is that we need to teach our students about consent, and consent has to be informed and freely given. And if you're in an institution and you feel an obligation to the people in charge of that institution, then that consent arguably isn't freely given. So I think there's a learning opportunity for us to work with our students to help them understand the importance of informed consent freely given.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point there. Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the information you presented. There's a lot of detail there. And I note you're saying acquisition, use and disposal of human material was carried out in full compliance with the legislative frameworks in place at the time, and you've set out some of how obviously that's become much stricter over time, and there has to be clear consent, and we recognise the importance of those who do consent to allow their body to be used for medical research and to advance that medical knowledge among trainee doctors in particular. 2,500, I think, since 1927, if that's the right figure, around that. So in terms of the focus of our inquiry, to distill all that down, what we're seeking to determine is You talked about implied consent, unless there's an objection. Was there a pattern at one time where, through implied consent, you talked about 5 children, I think, from other baby institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea of adults, implied consent, adults who died in institutions that bodies were passed on for medical research under the idea of implied consent, either because their families weren't known, or, I don't want to use a term inappropriately, but they'd almost been abandoned by their family?
Yeah.
You know, was there a practice of that happening? Can you shed any light on that?
Well, we refer to 451 body donations from the Belfast Union Workhouse as being that's a significant number. The legislation at the time provided that the person on front of the executor, the superintendent responsible for an institution, was enabled through the legislation to provide that consent, and provided that the immediate family had no objection. That was all was in there. So it was the consent of this third party, effectively. Our part of the work we want our historian colleagues to do is to understand what we believe was a narrative of people who were sadly in the workhouse where we had nothing. You wouldn't be there if you had any other alternative. But the university did, through the body donation scheme, and particularly in this area where it was a funeral was more expensive, an individual casket was expensive. That's what you got when the body was donated to the university. You got a burial in an individual coffin. And our understanding at this stage is that was maybe part of the social drivers for families, but that's why we've asked colleagues in history, colleagues who have specialised in research around workhouses and such like, who are scoping out the project for a postdoctoral researcher to fill in these gaps and give us a richer picture. And we can't see factually either way because we're limited with the information that we have.
Just to clarify, so your record showed around you're saying 451 adults,
yes,
bodies,
yes,
came from the Belfast. Was it Union Workhouse?
Belfast Union Workhouse.
Workhouse. And when you say they would have all or mostly would have received then a burial ultimately in a casket, are you saying?
Yes. Well,
what would have been the timescale, and would that have been a marked grave or would it have been unmarked? You know.
Timescale would have been...
Well, the 451 are since 1927, and then...
How long would they have been with the university before?
Yeah, how long do we keep a body for?
Yes.
Approximately a year, an academic year. So they would have been buried shortly after, on one of the plots in either the city cemetery or Roselawn.
So one of the issues we have back to memorialisation is that our plots don't record who's interred within them.
So unfortunately it wasn't a named grave then.
So it's not.
It would have been a general plot.
Well, we own them. We own them. They're not. There was separate provision under for councils and such like. We owned these graves. We bought these first of all city cemetery, more latterly at Roselawn, and it's our plots that we use for burial and have used for some time. So that's where we do have the grave papers. We can track those back.
And just last clarification, up to what year would that have been practice, those bodies coming from the workhouse?
Up to 1948, when the workhouse became the city hospital.
Yeah, the genesis of the city hospital is the Belfast Union Workhouse, and indeed there's the infirmary building still remains as part of the city hospital.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Timothy, please.
Your Chair, it seems to be some of the information released previously is contradictory to some of the figures you have told us today. On the back of all the FOI and the information going out, has there been a lot of people contacted Queen's to inquire when they've been doing family trees to try and find out where their loved ones are buried?
We've had comparatively few requests. I think once we have the data on a reliable platform, so we now have the logbooks transcribed into digital form, but we would like the grave papers linked to the individuals and the consent form. I think when we're in that position, we would want to make it publicly known that this facility was available for families who wanted to trace a family member. We're not there yet with getting everything lined up to provide that service, but that's what we want to do.
You've said that you're unaware of the final destination of all the bodies that could have been returned to the families.
Yep.
Can you stand over that you know every name of everybody that was donated to Queen's?
In so much as it's recorded, each name, that's what we have. The paper that the anatomy inspector holds has more information on it, a lot more information, and will generally include the death certificate, a copy of the death certificate, which we don't have.
You had mentioned that everybody was in an individual coffin,
Yeah.
and going by what you have answered previously, does that mean that there could be up to 6 coffins in the graves you own, and you're not aware of who's actually in them individual grave plots?
This bit of work that we need to do, we should be able to connect the grave paper records that we have back to the blood donation records, so we should be able to identify who's interred in which plot.
And final question regarding the memorials. So any names that's put in the memorials will be taken from the anatomy reports. So that's what you believe is the most up-to-date and the most accurate records. So that's what you'll be using then to populate a memorial if you're putting names on it.
So the only records we have are these logbooks, and when we go back further, we've got more comprehensive records for the last 40 years, etc. But that's the only names we have, and I think that will be part of the consultation process that we want to engage with. Is should memorials include a list of names, etc., or how should that be presented? So we're open to what that will look and feel like, and we'll rely on that consultation, and we're grateful for the assistance of others to contribute towards that.
That certainly would be my hope, that when you've been able to advance so many doctors and in the profession, that Queen's go that bit further, that you go along the process, you're able to identify who's in each grave, and then that's connected to the memorial accordingly.
At the city cemetery, I've visited both Roselawn and the city cemetery to view the university plots, and certainly at the city cemetery they have quite detailed grave papers, so one of the tasks we'd want to do is link those with our records from the anatomy department for individuals.
Final question, how many grave plots has Queen's?
Well, there are plots both at the city and Roselawn. I think they're at Roselawn, certainly they're distributed over an area, so I can't tell you how many acres we have, but there is quite a large plot at Roselawn that is related to the university.
So in terms of an individual plot, can't give you that number, but we can find out.
Did you?
Yep.
Emma?
Thanks, Chair. To be honest, my question has kind of been covered by Connie and Carol. That was what I was concerned around, reading the document you provided around the memorialisation and the thanks to donors. And I was concerned that there wasn't going to be an acknowledgement of the fact that some of these people's bodies were donated without any consent, and that we don't know an awful lot of these people's stories. But I think you've covered that in your responses. So thanks, Chair.
Sinead? Okay, thanks, Chair. First of all, I probably want to say thank you for the work that you've done since the last time we actually met, because there was a lot of major gaps. So, and that was way back in March 2022. So you have undertaken significant work in order to do that, and you are seeking to build a digital archive, and I think that's really important, and you are committed to a significant memorialisation exercise that is true and fitting for that. These are incredibly sensitive issues, whilst Queen's University have consistently said that they complied with the legal framework that was in place at the time, we now know, you know, retrospectively, how dire that those compliance and legal frameworks were when you're looking back at those frameworks 1832 and the Human Tissue Act even in 2004. The world has moved on and people deserve kind of answers. So thank you for the work that you're doing now. I know it's retrospect and you are working with logbooks and grave things, and a lot of the data isn't just quite where you would want it or how you would want it, but it's that sensitivity now that we require going forward. And consent is not consent as we know it today. No. You know, people are rightly concerned about their ancestors or their relatives that became, I don't want to say, just they were anonymised, they were nothing, they were a number, they were a logbook. And nothing more was known about them. So it's really important that you, as an academic institution, have taken on this work and have done so that we can get that transparency. Carl actually asked what I wanted to ask about, and that's about just that memorialisation and the sensitivity around that, and coming to, you know, just engaging with those that have ancestors or family members that have been part of this dire process throughout our society. So really, you've covered it, but I just wanted to acknowledge the work that you have done. This is definitely a different briefing than the previous briefing. There is movement here.
And we'll do more. You know, that's someone else being employed today to take this work forward. The partnership work with Prony, working with the Belfast City Council and the work that they've been undertaking at in the cemeteries on the interpretation and access to data, and they want to do more and work in partnership with us in relation to that. In terms of the evolution of consent, that will form part of this piece of work that we will employ a postdoctoral researcher to do, which is different from the human sensitivity aspect of it. So it's a kind of more legal, historic sort of piece, because consent is actually a relatively modern phenomenon. But against that all, and I'll defer to Alan here, because all I hear, I don't work in the School of Medicine, but being in the School of Medicine, you would be struck by the sensitivity that is demonstrated by all colleagues who are terribly conscious about language and approach and everything to do with the body donation and the sensitivity of that. And it's back to, as Alan said, you know, the sensitivity, we treat people with respect in life and in death. And that goes through the thread of teaching, not just of our doctors, our dentists, our nurses, through all our healthcare professionals.
I just want to go ahead. Did we want to add something? Were you wanting to add something there?
Very quickly, just to say that I think this meeting with the Executive Committee has been very helpful, because we tend to look at it through the lens of the present day, and we think of donations and consent in present day terms, but I think it's been helpful to draw us back to that. That wasn't always that way, and I think we do need to consult very carefully with the communities and make sure we reflect that in memorialisation.
I just want to move on. So your engagement with Belfast City Council, are any of the bodies in the unmarked graves in Milltown, is there any overlap in terms of what?
As far as we're aware, there are no Queen's bodies in Milltown Cemetery. Okay. It's all the City and Roselawn.
There is a potential which we haven't been able to of right back in the earlier part. There is a potential of Dundonald Cemetery. Okay. That's a potential we haven't been able to focus down on to be able to evidence that, but that would remain part of our continuing research to clear that up.
One complication of this is that anatomy teaching and dissection predates Queen's University.
Yeah.
So there's a period in the early part of the 19th century where INST was the institution doing anatomy teaching. So that's a murkier area, but one that we want to find out more about.
I'll bring in a second, Timothy, but in terms of that engagement with Belfast City Council, and obviously we as a committee have taken evidence in relation to the unmarked graves in Milltown Cemetery, and because I'm just wondering, is there anything that you as an academic institution are doing in that space as well, in terms of those parents who were bereaved and their children? Because
there's connections with Tom Hartley and the work that he's undertaken in colleagues with history, but I can ask history of that question, because that's really where it is. I would like.
It is a similar subject to this in terms of.
Yeah.
Okay. Timothy, go ahead.
Just quickly picking up on your point, you had said the potential of Dundonald. Can you expand on that and what do you mean by potential?
Yeah, because they're somehow in our casting the net widely, Dundonald Cemetery came up. Now we haven't been able to establish that we have any grave papers for Dundonald. I think that Belfast Society Council thought that there might be a Queen's connection with Belfast with Dundonald Cemetery, but we haven't been able. That's not been established yet. So it's kind of to be eliminated or consolidated.
Come from the council and not Queen's then?
I think so. I think so.
Okay.
The council are undertaking, or I'm not quite sure whether a project, but their digitisation project as well. They've created an interpretive centre at the cemeteries where you can. It does reflect the sort of history of the cemetery and notable people that are there, and also how to search in their database in the Milltown Cemetery. I think that they started with as to who's interred where.
Harry, you're being very patient here. I think Connie wants to come in with a small point as well.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a really sensitive one, and it's a really sensitive topic, and it is just throughout the course of this committee meeting I've had two people message me. One of them was one of the MLAs in this building who's been affected by this. So it is very sensitive. There's a lot of people in Northern Ireland who've been affected by this, and both are adamant that there are babies in Milltown Cemetery who were put in a mass grave that were from Queens. Their parents were told that their babies were at a Belfast Cemetery and there was no records, not Belfast Cemetery, a cemetery in Belfast, and they weren't told and they had no consent, and it is a very upsetting issue for them. And again, they're hearing about the memorialisation of this for the first time through this committee meeting, so just to be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, it'd be good to get any more information regarding that, particularly if it is suggested that the body came from Queens or via Queens.
Yeah, it did, yeah, with no consent. And they eventually did get, for want of a better word, as they describe, parts of the baby back.
It'd be good to take that offline and understand a bit more about that.
I think with a bit more information we can follow up with that, but the bulk of our work is teaching medical students with the bodies of deceased adults.
Yeah.
So the records that refer to children are the 49 children, and we do have records of burial and cremation for that they have been buried or cremated in most cases. So we could look at specific, and I think that's one of the things that we want to move towards when we have all this information on a digital platform.
And there is a distinction that the committee, I'm sure will understand, between we can only talk about bodies that came to Queen's for largely teaching and a little bit of research. They all had a death certificate beforehand, and then post-mortem, which is a different procedure, which is establishing a cause of death to enable a death certificate. And those are two different things. We don't do post-mortems. That's not what we do. Post-mortems are part of the criminal justice process, or part of the, in a hospital, if unable to certify the death, coroner may instruct post-mortem to establish the death, or their death certificate to be issued. And they're very different processes and not connected to the university.
I'm happy to follow up.
That would be good.
That'd be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Harry, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you. Prony were asked to assist in the TEO-led Truth Recovery Programme in 2022, and there was talk of a phased approach, like phase 1 An archival survey was undertaken to determine if record holders were compliant with new Preservation Documents Act 2022. And then phase 2 worked to determine how many of the records identified during phase 1 could be accessed and catalogued and digitised. It then goes on to say about phase 3 is currently ongoing. Do you know what's going on with phase 3 at present?
Not sure about the phasing, but I know we've had meetings with PRONI. We've had PRONI officials have come and have seen the books that we have. They are aware of the digitisation project, and we have got correspondence from them this week about us getting an agreement where we will give them a copy of the digitised records so that they can utilise that. But we've been quite clear with PRONI that we're in partnership. We are provide whatever information we have, but it's limited. A return to a bit of a hobby horse, though, is we need to chase down somewhere where the anatomy inspector records are, because they're the comprehensive record, and that was where, and the legal, we've talked about the legal framework. The legal framework required the anatomy inspector to maintain these records, and our duty in the logbook was a working document. The actual record went to the anatomy inspector, and that's the missing link in this. I'm sure it might be useful maybe for the committee, once we receive copies from the National Archives in Dublin, you can see a sample of what that record looked like, and that means there's a lot of information missing.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I suppose this conversation is in the context of mother and baby homes, but this is a much wider conversations. Do you look at that in the wider context, just I suppose to add knowledge to your work? And then I suppose to pick up on points made around consent and maybe perhaps repeating these. I suppose it was a different framework and a different perspective of consent at the time. So it was almost as maybe Brian's describing it as implied consent. But is there any knowledge where there was explicitly no consent? And how was that dealt with? And even retrospectively, have people added to that work and just your work around consent moving forward?
The 1832 Act introduced the authority, I think would be better to say, rather than consent, because consent's like something actively that we would do. It provided an authorising environment. We're going back a long time in history.
Yeah.
1828, 4 years before that, were the murders committed by Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. And this was the era of grave robbing. And the 1832 Act was about regularising the provision of bodies to medical education, which was growing at that time. So part of the work our colleagues in history will do is that arc of history and the social history and the changes over time. So everything from 1832 onwards has a form of consent, but I would maybe describe it as authorisation. Rather than consent. To take Carol's point, it's a very active thing that someone does as opposed to being done to you or for you. So it's an authorising environment. And that,
to pick up your specific point about were bodies ever used where consent had been expressly withheld by the person in their lifetime or by a family member, that would be in breach of the law at the time. But it's something we would certainly look into. The executor in possession of the body could make the decision, and that would apply whether it was a resident of a workhouse or whether the executor was talking about a prosperous citizen who died in a private home. I would guess that probably more donations went from the workhouse simply because of that dependent relationship that the workhouse resident had to the superintendent of the workhouse.
And who was the authoriser in those cases? I'm trying to think of it in terms of next in kin, or was it the workhouse because they were in that institution?
My understanding is it would be the workhouse because they were in possession of the body. And the Act is quite clear. As an undertaker, you're not in possession of the body, you're simply passing it through for the purposes of burial. But as the superintendent of a workhouse, you would be in possession of the body and responsible for it.
I'm thinking of it perhaps maybe more mothers and babies. So if a baby was taken without consent, is it the Workhouse institution they may have been in authorisation, or is it the mother's?
So the records that we have from the Workhouse all relate to adults.
Okay.
And the only infants we have relate to the Thorndale, the 5 from Thorndale.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other? No. Okay. Thank you again. Really, really interesting, and I really, really appreciate your time today, gentlemen. And again, if you can send through your notes, that will give us a bit more detail. We would really appreciate an update on the memorialisation process when you've actually put a bit of flesh on that. But good luck with your work.
This has been a really useful meeting.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, members, would you want a couple of minutes? Yes. Yeah, okay. We'll just suspend the meeting for 5 minutes and we'll come back then. Thank you.
Committee Room 30, sound. 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 Committee Room 30, sound.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to take our final oral briefing this afternoon on mother and baby institutions, and this time we're looking at records and access to data. So we have representatives from PRONI and the Human Rights Commission. So there's papers in your pack there. There's a briefing for the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and a briefing from PRONI. And so I'm going to welcome to the meeting David Huddleston, who's Acting Director of PRONI, Wesley Geddes, Acting Head of Records, Management PRONI, Joy Carey, is it Carey? Yes, Carey, Project Manager, Mother and Baby Institutions at PRONI, and then we've got Alison Kilpatrick, who's Chief Commissioner at the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, Dr. Hannah Russell, who's Senior Policy and Research Officer, also at the Human Rights Commission, and I think we have Emma. Yes, good to see Emma Osborne, who's Policy and Research Officer, the Human Rights Commission. She's sitting in the gallery, but we may bring you in if some questions are for you. Okay, members, do you just want to brief us and maybe turn to yourselves first, since you got so many mentions in the last session?
Chair, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to provide briefing to the committee. As you said, I'm David Huddleston, colleagues Wesley and Joy from the Public Record Office. I'm just going to start with a very brief high-level introduction to the records and archiving strand to the Truth Recovery programme. So this is the element of work that the Public Record Office has been doing in support of the Truth Recovery programme. So it's seen a lot of cross-departmental engagement and cooperation between ourselves, the Executive Office and other departments such as the Department of Health and Department of Justice. There's been very productive relationship developed with the independent panel members. We've obviously been working closely with those, and Joy will say a little bit more about that. There's been, in our view, a lot of positive outcomes by securing the cooperation of private record holders, particularly the records of the religious orders and religious institutions, to secure those records. Work is continuing to progress. And there are ongoing negotiations between staff in PRONI as part of the Department for Communities and various record holders, both private and official, to secure additional records relating to the mother and baby institutions, the workhouses, and the Magdalen laundries. And we've also engaged with consultative forum members who earlier this year visited Prony to be able to see the archive work firsthand within the Public Record Office building in Titanic Quarter and have the opportunity to ask questions and engage with staff directly during that visit. I'm going to pass over to Wesley to give a little bit more detail.
Thank you. So, as David had said, Prony officials have been working with the Executive Office and the Department of Health to assist the work of the Truth Recovery Programme over the last 2 years. During that time, we've also assisted the independent panel research team, that's led by Professor Leanne McCormick, in identifying and gathering and cataloguing and preserving archives and documents relating to the mother and baby institutions, Magdalen laundries and workhouses, and also to identify the related practices that operated within those organisations. Now, to date, as David had mentioned, it has been very positive work carried out by Prony to date, and this has been helped by the passing of the Preservation of Documents Act in 2022, which allowed records to be preserved and not be destroyed or amended or removed from this jurisdiction that relate to those organisations. So that's been very successful and been very useful for us to make sure that records stay here and we can then work on them. I'll pass over to Joy.
Thank you, Wesley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just carry on to tell you a little bit of the project progress update. So in 2022, at the end of 22, the Department for Communities was contacted by the Executive Office, and Minister Hargey at that time agreed that Prony officials would be best placed to assist the Truth Recovery Programme. So we were appointed to support the independent panel in one of their terms of reference to gather, preserve, catalogue and digitise the relevant records and archives, and to engage with authorities and institutions, organisations and individuals in Ireland North and South and across the jurisdictions. During phase 1, an archival survey then was undertaken to determine what records are held throughout those different organisations, to determine whether the record holders are compliant with the new Preservation of Documents Act, which Wesley has talked about. The survey revealed that over 4,500 individual items, such as registers, minute books, case files, were held across 7 private organisations, and those organisations were religious orders, charities, adoption societies and other church bodies that were identified in the report that was produced by Professors O'Connell and McCormick in 2021. Phase 2 then was a short pilot project last summer, and that was to determine how many of those records that we would be able to access in order to preserve them, so to catalogue them and to digitise them, and to estimate how long it might take for us to do the entire set for the 7 institutions. So phase 3 is currently underway, and the team in Prony at the moment are involved in identifying and negotiating access to privately and officially owned records. And as my colleagues have said, over 3,000 records out of those 4,500 have already been digitised and preserved by the team during the past year, including 2 large significant collections from religious orders. Specific details of the records that we've received to date and those that are still outstanding have been included in your briefing packs.
Okay. And just to sort of round off our introduction, Prony's focus is to preserve the information contained in the records, to ensure that they can obviously assist with research and investigation, but also to support any future redress scheme that may come about. The Prony is committed to ensuring that affected persons or victims and survivors are assisted in any way possible, and that we can deal with this very sensitive topic and ensure that comes to a successful outcome for victims and survivors. So on that note, we're happy to take any questions that you may have.
Just want to maybe just go straight to yours and then we'll do questions together. Thank you, Alison. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting us today. We're very happy to be here. Hope we can assist you. I'll just mention again my colleagues, Hannah Russell to my right and Emma Osborne behind me. They've been instrumental in the Commission's work to date, and I'm hoping they'll be able to contribute as the discussion develops, and they'll also answer the questions that I fail to answer. We
want to be as helpful as possible, but what we thought might be of interest to start with is to give you an understanding of those foundational human rights principles upon which others will build, so those developing the inquiry and the research projects. We start by noting there's been a decades-long veil of secrecy and deception thrown over institutions, their practices and pathways, which must now be lifted. Victims, survivors and their relatives deserve once and for all to be treated respectfully and with dignity, and to be empowered and have confidence in the system. They have various rights, but that includes the right to access information, to develop knowledge and understanding, to uncover the truth and to assume power over past traumatic events. They're entitled to know what happened, as is society. The state has an obligation to uncover the truth and prevent it happening again, and that preventative obligation is central to much of what you will be considering. There must also be redress for victims of past human rights violations, and that will not least go to protecting against the creation of new victims. There are other rights at play: to be protected from the misuse or manipulation of information, to the protection of one's privacy, and to protection from false accusation. So there are grave responsibilities in the management of information and in its disclosure, which can't be taken lightly. The proper exercise of responsibility will require a balancing exercise to be undertaken in each case. But that balancing exercise will be considerably easier to manage, more reliable, and ultimately lawful, only if enforceable human rights standards inform all the decision-making and action. And in the context of mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries and workhouses in Northern Ireland, the relevant information is likely to comprise highly personal records. Those records will be sensitive, and the information contained within them may be highly emotive. By way of example, information may include the identity of a birth mother, father or wider family, the identity of an adopted child, information relating to disappeared family members, information relating to babies buried in unmarked graves. Access to information can be important to a victim and survivor of the institutions and their relatives for a variety of reasons, but sometimes just knowing is enough. Sometimes it helps process trauma, including transgenerational trauma. It can be critical for medical reasons. It's a prerequisite to accessing an effective remedy for violations. And there are many more examples. There are other people better placed to share that with you, people who are directly affected. There is also information required for the purposes of creating and maintaining a historical record of what happened, which is critical for society to understand systemic issues and work to preventing them happening again. Both publishing and protecting information can be very beneficial, but they can also be detrimental. Decisions cannot be taken lightly, as I've said. They must involve a full examination of the circumstances and be informed by the interests of the people affected. A proper understanding of the rights at play will be essential. And by way of overview, that includes access to information, the right to access information, and all the interconnected rights to truth, respect for family life, to health, to access personal data, and to receive an effective remedy for a violation. But they must be balanced against the rights to privacy and data protection. Just as one victim or survivor or their relatives may wish to have access to information, another may wish for no one or only select individuals or organisations to have access to their personal records or information linked to their experience. In our briefing paper and in our response to consultation, we set out in some detail the structure, processes and safeguards, and we're very happy, ready and willing to provide further written advice or answers to any questions arising from that. We're certainly here today to answer any questions you have today.
Thank you. Are you also wanting to make some opening? No. Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to bring Sinead in because you have to
dash on. So
yes.
Thank you very much for your briefing. I have two questions. The first one to Prony, and it's: what challenges have you faced obtaining records from across the border in the south? And then I'll ask the other one to yourself, Alison. In your paper, you state very clearly, you obviously state about the veil of secrecy in and around all of this, but you state that the inquiry has effective powers of compellability. Can you just tell us why you think that is so important, but what could be the unintended consequences could be if this doesn't take place?
In terms of the challenges of securing papers from across the border, I suppose there's been a number of challenges, but probably the main issue has really been around working with the religious institutions and the different agencies and bodies that have records on both sides of the border. That's been an ongoing process from that initial survey, making contact. I suppose going in to do that initial survey, explaining the legal requirement under the 2022 Act in terms of preservation. I suppose that's provided the legal underpinning in terms of the preservation, that the preservation of the records is critical in this to ensure that that information is going to be available for the public inquiry and for victims and survivors. I was going to ask Joy just for you to speak sort of to the specifics of, because you have secured records, they've come north, they've been digitised, and that work's been ongoing.
That's right. Yeah, it's, a few of the collections that we first of all surveyed were located in the Republic of Ireland, but we were able to still go down because the records are privately owned and they're not statutory official records of government. PRONI have the remit to be able to collect records from any private organisation according to putting a private deposit agreement together and in place. So through that particular part of our Public Record Act 1923, there's a particular section in it, Section 5, which permits that gathering of records from non-official sources. So that was how we were able to gather those records that do pertain to the north of Ireland but are now held in the south. And that they've been located there previous to the 2022 Preservation of Documents Act coming into place. So we negotiated access to those, and we've actually received more records than were first surveyed, which is a positive thing, and that also includes some records of facilities which were across the border, for example, in County Donegal, the Fawn Nazareth House in County Donegal. Yeah.
So would you say that you're pleased with the ability of being able to get those records? You've no concerns?
I believe that for those organisations whose records have been collected already, yes, they do. I think they understand the enormity of this and the fact that what has already been preceded in the Republic of Ireland, and the fact that cooperation is going to have to happen sooner or later.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we think the power to compel is vital to a public inquiry. Without it, we suspect you're unlikely to get people coming forward to disclose wrongdoing, at least not the majority, certainly not if they are implicated themselves. To get to the truth, to hold accountable, and to learn lessons, the inquiry needs to be able to decide itself where it goes and to follow all lines of inquiry. And that includes from people who don't want to be there in the first place. And the only way, by experience, you get people there who don't want to be there is by compelling them. But the power to compel must have teeth as well. And the only thing I'd add to that is that there are also rights for those who may be implicated. And those have to be built in. So safeguards do need to be built in. So it's not just the rights to information, it's the rights not to be incriminated in a criminal offence, for example. But all of that can be quite easily, if not quickly, put into the rules of procedure for the public inquiry. And in any event, the public inquiry would be subject to the Human Rights Act, which will have all those fundamental human rights. Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I suppose in terms of adopting a victim-centred approach, and flowing from what Alison has just said there, there's obviously the very legal side of things, but there's also the very human side as well, and ensuring that there is a well-developed system for compellability, and it's not forcing a victim and survivor into a position that they may be re-traumatised or re-victimised. Yeah. So that needs to be considered, and I suppose there's two prongs to this. There's the obtaining of the information, and then what you're going to do with that information. So all within that, you need to ensure that the system in place has a solid foundation, and that's where we would draw in the kind of human rights aspects of that.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Sinead. I just want to pick up on the point around the documents, and when I've engaged with birth mothers and even adopted adults now. They would say that sometimes the records may well have been falsified, you know, in terms of the forced adoption and moved outside this jurisdiction, or that there were records held within the church that don't match up with what's within the institutions. And so how, in terms of your project, how are you dealing with where there's deliberate or otherwise mistakes in the records?
Well, the more records that we collect from different sources, we're able to cross-reference different pieces of information and discover, you know, where there's maybe anomalies, in different parts of the data that we've collected. So that's useful. And we are going out to other organisations such as, you know, Belfast City Council to look at those cemetery records, and we've also had some engagement with the Diocese of Down and Connor over the Milltown records, and obviously the General Record Office as well, that we are able to access those records to just cross-reference details about deaths and adoptions from other collections of records that are there.
Okay. It's difficult from an archival perspective, you know, to test the veracity of those records. We're receiving the physical records, we're going to be cataloguing and digitising them. If the information in them isn't accurate, that's going to come to light through research, through inquiries, probably through the independent panel, through individuals. But as part of that archiving process, it will not necessarily be immediate that yes, this information is falsified or is incorrect, unfortunately.
Have you anything to add to that, Alison, from the sort of human rights perspective of people, you know?
Well, I think
records?
the principle of open and transparent would help a lot, particularly to the wider distribution. The more likely you're going to have people noticing where things have been falsified.
Yes.
And victims and survivors obviously need to see the documents and be able to comment. They probably know better than anybody else whether something's true or not. But also the public inquiry, that's why powers of compellability are so important.
Yes.
You can compel documents and a person to explain the documents, and they can be questioned in relation to what may appear to be falsified or not inconsistent, at least.
Okay.
So I think the two things go together. Let other people see the documents, not just archive them, so put them as open, as wide as possible.
That's a good point. Do you want to come in?
Alison's just kind of taken
the
point there, but I suppose just to really drive that home, indexing is a really key point here from our, now I admit fairly limited discussions, but with our discussions with victims and survivors, they're saying that being aware of what information isn't available is almost as revealing as knowing what information they may have access to. So that's kind of an early thing of being aware of what information is there and what may not be there.
Okay. I've got a second one, and it picks up on your point, Alison, there around the protection of privacy. And when I've engaged with people who've been adopted, you know, they said that when they eventually got a social worker to get their birth record or their stuff on their files around their adoption, so much of it's redacted, obviously to protect the privacy of the mother, etc. So how in law does that sit on, well, you know, what changes are needed to ensure that people get more information that they deserve?
That's quite a difficult one to answer in the general.
Okay.
It's easier to answer in a case-by-case basis, which is the way that whoever is deciding would need to do it.
Okay.
But I would say I'm not sure the law needs to change, but it needs to be applied properly.
Okay.
So what you get often is misuse or overuse of the GDPR as a reason to block information.
Yes.
Which doesn't need to be blocked under those regulations or under the Act.
Yeah.
And it should be, you start from the premise that you're entitled to have it if it relates to you, but you're not entitled to have it if it relates to somebody else necessarily. So it is, I mean, the problem is there's no easy answer.
Yeah,
it does require balancing various rights. But far too often I see, and I've seen it in every piece of work we do, redactions where they're wholly unnecessary. So somebody has to be able to assess whether or not those are. So there needs to be a right of redress to not being given information. But it's tricky. It's not. I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Okay. Carol?
Yeah, thank you. So it's the last point, Alison. It's just that it's this overuse of redaction in order. So that's something that's been raised. If people actually do get access, it's quite hurtful. So we're hoping the public inquiry will be able to get rid of that, and as you say, it will be, you know, human rights compliant and Article 2 and Article 8 and all that. But in terms of yourselves and Prony, and good to see you again. So, do you get many records from the institutions that have been redacted?
They will not be
they
redacted.
haven't
They're
been
coming
redacted.
unredacted.
Okay, and then even in terms of Dublin, because I remember speaking to a family recently who are Church of Ireland, and they said that their relative was born in is it Bethany home in Dublin. Are you getting access to records? They're a private institution. Are they one of the private institutions that...
At the minute, we're looking at the institutions that were located in the north
report?
Yes, where there are instances where people have maybe moved from one institution to another. That's more the research side of things, where Professor McCormick is looking at that, and just looking at the kind of cross-border element and everything on that too. Yeah. So at the minute, we're focusing on gathering the records for those institutions which were within the north of Ireland, and then making sure that information is preserved and kept safe so that it can be accessed in the future.
Okay, and is there any covenants or any restrictions put on by any of the religious orders or their churches about releasing records?
At the moment, we're bringing those in under a deposit agreement that we engage with them, so it's tailored to what, you know, it's between the two parties, us and them, you know, how we arrange that. And they're coming in as closed records, and they're closed under the Data Protection Act. And then, yes, we have to revert any inquiries about access to those records back to that organisation, because they're not official statutory documents. That's the situation at the moment.
So that's my concern, because if someone was to request a record under 1923 or
Data Protection Act or
Data Protection, non-FOI, then if it's non-FOI, then it's for them alone, and there's still that barrier there then?
There is, yes.
So, I mean, in essence, and between that and then the Irish government wants to seal the records as well.
That's right.
So I'm just really concerned that while a public inquiry will have compellability of people and papers and all that, there's all that other stuff to get through. And I just feel that particularly when this was all cloaked in secrecy, and you know, the insensitivity of how women and girls and babies were treated, and for those covenants and those restrictions still to be in place, I'd like to know what we could do as a committee to try and ask those questions in advance of an inquiry.
If I could add, what is also a massive issue is the stuff that was never put on paper deliberately, so it couldn't be traced.
Exactly.
Which is why the public inquiry would be so important to compel people to give evidence. But what I would also say is that including victims and survivors and their relatives at such an early stage, even before the inquiry is set up, will enable you to identify what needs to be asked. Because they will know what's missing. As Hannah said, it's sometimes what's missing that's more telling. And that doesn't just make... It's not just the right thing to include them. It's the only way you're going to get an effective inquiry. But you need to include them right at the beginning, so you know what you're asking for.
What's the department that's doing the public inquiry?
Yeah.
So, and we'll be scrutinising the department. So what I would suggest, and you know yourself in terms of reference set, if it's not in that, it may be added at a later stage, but it may not.
Yeah.
So if there's issues that you think you all need clarification on or think it needs to be included, I think it would be wise to bring those forward.
Hannah has a...
Yeah, there's just a practical thing that came to our attention. So we understand that whenever someone requests information, as you've been saying, and gets that, I think it's a table back to say we can't release this information. We understand that it, and I could be corrected on this, but that it purely states there's third-party information and that's it. So one additional step that could be taken is providing some idea of what that third-party information is. Is it a name? You know, it's a name, we can't, it's an address, we can't. Because then that will then start to become clear of, is this just being redacted because someone's just decided that it's the easiest thing to do, or someone's trying to cover something up, because there can be multiple things at play. So that's a very simple shift that could happen, and also falls within giving reasons as to why the redaction is occurring. Now, there is a balance to be had there, because that can take up a lot of resource, and I think that we do need to acknowledge that. But we're asking for reasonable use of resource here, and ensuring that the process is as transparent as possible.
If I may just add one last thing, Carol. There's also the society's right to know what happened, how it happened, whether it could happen again. So it's not just about giving information to those who request it. It's the gathering and dissemination of this information should be to everyone, unless and until there's a legitimate reason not to.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy, please.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions first of all to yourself, Alison. 2.1 of your evidence on page 93 of our pack. It states the TEO should make sure information can be accessed and preserved. My office has been contacted by an elderly gentleman who wanted to read the inquiry report. There's no physical copies available. Is that a case of, will that change, or is it a digital only for anybody wanting to access information?
I think that's more probably a question for...
Yeah, we are digitising the records that we're gathering, but they could still be printed for someone if they were looking for specific information about their own individual circumstances, and they're found to be, legally permitted to see that information. Then, of course, we can provide it in whatever format is most appropriate for them and that they would request from us.
More widely, we are archiving doing web archiving and archiving official websites with reports and inquiry reports, and the future inquiry website would be something which obviously would be critical to preserve. So again, a paper copy could be provided if an individual isn't able to access it digitally.
Sorry, I think Hannah wants to...
Yeah, Hannah, can I add to that? Yeah, I actually think you're raising quite a valid point there in terms of accessibility and making sure that the system is as accessible as possible, because there will be people with specific needs in terms of they have a disability or, hard of sight loss issues, etc. So that does need, I think, to be taken into account in a broader sense, but we should be doing that across the board anyway.
Yeah. Moving on, and 2.22 to 2.30, pages 100 to 102 of the pack. There's talk.
I'm struggling to pick up, but it's kind of a noise coming from here. Can you? Would you mind repeating that?
2.22.
Yeah.
Okay, 2.30.
Right to respect for
private family life. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. So the TEO, while making information accessible, how can you respect the right to private family life? How can you square that? To me, that the two seem contradictory.
Well, they shouldn't be, and that's where the human rights approach, I would say, is the best one, because it provides you with a balancing exercise, provides the steps to go through and look at when sometimes there are competing rights, but not all the time. Quite often the rights support each other. The right to private and family life can be to access information about your own life or your own parents, for example. It's not just an interference. It can be a right to enhance your family life or your personal life.
2.57 talks about principle 3 of, can you pronounce them principles and enlighten me what they are? I'm new to this and I've never came across, is it Orient Lecture principles?
Yeah. Do you want to? Sorry, we're going to call Em up here. Who's doing the work on that? If that's all right.
I can tell you in general terms. These are all.
First of all, just am I close enough, or?
Well, I'm not saying I will pronounce it properly. Orient Liquor is how I pronounce it, but I think. I struggle sometimes just pronouncing English words.
Apologies, folks, for that. Yes, sorry. So those principles they come from the UN High Commissioner's Office, and they've put together principles on the right to truth, and so it's a long list of principles then that basically kind of give an interpretive kind of model to that right.
And would that impact on the legacy proposals?
That's maybe a question for Hannah.
The way these principles work is that they are used to interpret if there's ambiguity or a doubt about what the primary legislation or the enforceable standards say. So they don't, it's not a freestanding right to take something from the Article principles and take them to a court, but what it can do is be helpful in interpreting what the European Convention on Human Rights means, or what the Human Rights Act means in any practical scenario. In the same way that it would apply to the right to an investigation in one of these cases, it would apply in the right to investigation of, for example, an unsolved murder, which is what some of the legacy cases are. So yes, the same principles apply, but they're not freestanding rights, they're just used to interpret.
Section 3 of your evidence talks about Article 2 of the Windsor Framework.
Yeah.
Can you just give us a wee bit more about that? People would try to make us believe that the Windsor Framework only relates to trade, so can you tell us how that relates to your day-to-day and primarily to Section 3?
When you say Section 3, you mean 3 of this
Evidence,
briefing? Yeah. Well, I think I could be here all night, and there's a lady behind me who could be here until tomorrow evening, just talking about the Windsor Framework. But let me keep it really simple, because it's only Article 2 really that applies in relation to what we're concerned with, which is the human rights aspect. All it does is stop us falling behind that which was already signed up to before Brexit. So we don't see it as anything tying the hands necessarily of anyone. But it does preserve standards as they were prior to Brexit.
Brony, just quickly, you've said 4 out of the 7 institutions originally surveyed have now deposited the records. Did it pick up that the other 3 are in the process of doing that, or is there resistance there? And can you name the 3? Because you named the 4.
There's 3 which are outstanding, which are the Salvation Army, Bernardo's and Family Care Adoption Services, which is a local voluntary adoption agency. The Salvation Army, we're currently developing a data sharing agreement with them, and we have got agreement in principle to go over to their archive in London in Denmark Hill, and the Prony team would digitise their records on site there. So that they are in the process of providing that information to us for use by the independent panel. Bernardo's have agreed to permit the independent panel with access to any specific information they request, but in an anonymised format. So at the moment they're committed to protecting the confidentiality of those data subjects, and they have emphasised the fact that they feel that at the moment there's no legal mandate for them to provide them to Prony as the National Archive in Northern Ireland. They prefer to be the unique data controllers of that information.
That would be something you would challenge their view on that?
We don't currently have really the legislation to be able to challenge that. The Preservation of Documents Act provides information to those organisations to say that they must not destroy, damage or take out of the jurisdiction those records, but it doesn't state yet that that they must provide copies of them to Prony, nor does it say that Prony will police or look after to check how compliant they are with that legislation. So that's really, we need to, at the moment we're working on gaining their cooperation and encouraging them of the benefit of depositing records with Prony. But organisations such as Bernardo's and the Salvation Army, they already have, they're compliant with the Act. They've suitable archival standard storage in place in their archive centres, and they're dealing with subject access requests for information from individuals according to the legislation, and they have considerable experience in doing so. So at the moment, they're compliant in as far as we can see with the legislation.
And the third one?
The third one is family care. At the moment, family care are willing to provide the independent panel researchers with access to information on their site, but they're unwilling to provide Prony with access to undertake a digitisation project of their information. At the moment, they act under the Adoption Agency's regulations of 1989, and that particular piece of legislation doesn't enable them to transfer a copy of their information to Prony. There's very restricted situations when they are able, according to that legislation, to transfer that information. So they can transfer it to another adoption agency or to the department or to people whose information is contained within, for example, the adoption information. But there's nothing to state that they can transfer it to another third party. So they have explained to us that they've put additional measures in place to further comply with the Preservation of Documents Act, and we have arranged access early next month to go and see those further preservation measures that they've put in place to comply with the Preservation of Documents Act. So we'll be reporting back to the Department of Health on that after the visit.
You have anything from Stephen right now? Okay. Harry, please.
Thank you, Chair. And this is the Prony. So from when you would request a minute book or document, is there a set time that you're allowed to keep that in your possession?
The deposit agreement that we have with the institutions at the moment is for us to permanently preserve that information in a digital format. So the team in Prony are creating the digital copy. We provide a digital surrogate to that organisation, and we retain a copy ourselves. We prefer, because our work is all about preserving that information for as long as it possibly can be, so we would prefer that they use that digital copy as opposed to accessing the physical document, so that the handling, is kept to a minimum. So yeah, the copy that we retain, then we would like to preserve that for as long as possible, and they see the benefit of that because they do understand the historical significance of the record.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Can we perhaps just
yes, please?
Yes, because that's raised a really important point around in terms of the permanency of the preservation. So the inquiry is one thing and a very important aspect of this, but it's what happens after the inquiry process and making sure that all of the information that was gathered by the inquiry is archived properly, and then obviously a proper process for access to information, which hopefully would include some form of public element to that as well, not just on an individual basis as well.
Very good, thank you for adding that. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Any final points you probably wanted to make, but you didn't get a chance to? No.
I was just to say, really, when records do come to Prony, we do not alter or amend any of the records that come into our possession. People, members of the public, may ask that record is wrong, that land boundary is wrong, change it, Prony, but we do not do that. We ask them to go through the official channels and refer back, so that maintains the authenticity of the record once it has arrived in Prony. That's very important just to remind ourselves of that. What has happened whilst it's in the institution or in the public authority, that is up to them. We just make sure that has been amended, or not amended rather, and if amendments are made, then that's reflected in the document officially.
Yes.
Subsequent to that. So
and just the counterpoint, I suppose, to that is the primary reason for preservation is to provide access. We're not just preserving records for the sake of preservation. It is to provide access. We're not a giant warehouse. We have, highly in terms of our repositories and vaults, all of that's very carefully managed, but key in terms of truth recovery is being able to work with victims and survivors to ensure that they will be able to have access to information. And I think Alison's point is very important as well, that wider societal, you're not going to be able to open all of these records to the general public, but with limited redactions, a lot of this, it's right that this information, that people have the opportunity to understand it, that there will be educational elements in terms of what happened in the past, so that people don't forget, and that there's the lessons that are learnt from that. So I'm just balancing preservation and access. The two go together, really hand in hand in terms of this work.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time in preparing for the meeting and today. So thanks again. I think we will be seeing you soon, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, in terms of our committee inquiry. So look forward to that. Thank you. Okay, members, moving on quickly. There's an SR. I've just checked with the clerk. Do we need to do it today? And he said yes. So there's an SR on period products, Executive Office, Specified Public Service Bodies Regulations, Northern Ireland 2024. So you'll find the clerk's brief on page 137 of your pack, cover note just after that, and then the SL5 letter, then the draft regulations, and then the draft explanatory memorandum, and then the 23rd report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules. So, members, Executive Office is proposing to make a statutory rule to specify by regulations those public service bodies to which the duty to make free period products available for users while on their premises applies. So just to advise you that we did consider and approve the SL1 policy document for this rule at our meeting on the 11th of September this year. There have been no changes to the policy content since the SL1 was submitted to the committee. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has no issues to raise, and the SR is subject to the draft affirmative procedure. So I'm just going to ask, are you happy to proceed?
Great.
Okay. So on that basis, I'm going to ask you to formally agree that the Committee for the Executive Office has considered the SR 2024, the Period Products Executive Office Specified Public Service Bodies Regulation NI 2024, and recommends that it is approved by the Assembly. Okay,
Great.
Thank you. Okay, this is giving me nightmares from the Health Committee. Remember, per column, Kildare, you had to read out hundreds of these. But anyway, item 10 on the agenda there, it's the inquiry into gaps in equality legislation. Just to update, the clerk and his team have provisionally booked the Long Gallery for Wednesday the 4th of December from 9 till 11 a.m. for an event with stakeholders, with the idea of 6 or 7 roundtables, with each allocated to one of the Section 75 groups, and each table will have at least one committee member to facilitate the discussion. Are you happy to? Are you content to proceed with that approach?
I think my other committee is away that week, and I don't know if I'll be here.
4th of December.
I think we're away the 2nd to the 4th.
Ooh.
What is your other committee?
It's the Windsor Framework.
Oh yes, of course.
I really annoyed somebody. So.
It's difficult to time for Wednesday morning because of standards, and it's when the standards and privileges isn't meeting.
Yeah, well, if you are happy enough.
Okay. Well, we'll maybe do by email then, people who are going to be available that morning, because it is important that we have at least one committee member at each table so we can actually hear and then feedback. So are you content for us to go ahead with that date? Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So draft forward work programmes is page 160 of your meeting pack, and just to remind you that our meeting next week is up in the Ebrington Hotel, and so people can go up for the visit at 12:30, but the meeting itself will actually start at 2 p.m.
Darcy, in terms of the rest of our work programme,
Yes.
and there's groups that are down as to be confirmed.
Yes.
So what's happening with those? Because they've been down for quite a while.
Which ones? Some of them might have.
So it's the Irish language ones have, and
they're both confirmed now.
And was the Ulster Scots Agency asked to come in?
Just today, yeah.
Right. Okay. And
Did they confirm today?
Confirmed today.
Yes.
Okay.
Because we hadn't heard back from the Ulster Scots Agency, so
I
we were
thought that.
going to that. Go ahead.
Before you go off that, I made mention earlier on about the Women's Rights Network and some of the concerns they had and wanted to feed into the strategic framework of ending violence against women and girls. Is that a possibility that they could come to an evidence session?
Yeah, I suppose there's two elements. I wasn't sure where you're going with that, because there's this, but there's also then their opportunity to come to the stakeholder event around our gaps in equality legislation, you know, in terms of engagement around that. So what would the purpose of it be in terms of the Executive Office's work?
Well, essentially, it's them being invited along. They might have a slightly different view and concerns regarding, as I mentioned earlier on, about the definition of a woman not being included in this, and it'd be their opportunity to present to this committee why they believe that something like that should be.
What do members think?
I think it's probably for the department, Timothy, for them to go and ask.
Or could there at least be dialogue with them?
And the officials, even, just that were in the day.
Well,
for them to go and meet.
I think that we need to go back to Claire Archibald, because she did indicate
Aaron Geraldine.
She did indicate that they were going to find out what engagement has happened before. So if
I don't think there's been any.
Well, we'll get that clarified, because by right the co-design, the whole process should have been as inclusive as possible. And so if we can get that clarification around that, I suppose in some ways the issue is that this is now printed, and so it's really about how or whether any material going forward would include that. So let's see what the department comes back with in terms of Claire and her team, and then we'll bring it to this committee for discussion. Is that okay?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so obviously we're just up till December the 11th, and then we go into recess, so that will be us into January. So obviously the clerk will have a list of people for the new year to sort of start bringing in others, but do feed in anybody else that you think that we should be trying to engage around our areas. Okay, so I'm going to move on to correspondence there, and I just want to raise the issue of the complaint that was received by the clerk. It's in your table papers there, and just to advise that this was off the back of the meeting last week, but the clerk has responded to advise them to go to the Standards Commissioner. Okay, anything else to raise?
And that, is that a publicly available document essentially, or is it just for this committee?
Any correspondence is for the committee unless the committee agrees to publish or release it to a third party.
So the two letters last week essentially fall under the same remit?
If they're received by this committee, yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay, everyone. So please make a special effort to get to Derry next week, because
apologies, I
know,
so.
but it'll be a good visit, and obviously it's a key part of the department's work as well in terms of that strategic investment. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Committee Room 30, sound.